Clara Whitmore pressed the barrel of her Winchester against the stranger's chest before he had both feet through her gate. "You take one more step, and I will put you in the ground right next to my husband." Her hands were shaking. Her lips were blue from cold. There was not a single log left beside the cabin door, and the temperature was dropping fast enough to kill a healthy man by morning. The stranger didn't move. He didn't raise his hands. He just looked at her with the quietest eyes she had ever seen on a man who wasn't afraid to die. If this story already has your heart beating faster, hit that subscribe button right now and follow along until the very end, because this one is going to stay with you. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The Winchester didn't waver. Clara Whitmore had learned many things in the 29 years she had lived on this earth, but the most important lesson had come in the last 8 months since James died. She had learned that a woman alone on a failing ranch in Montana Territory was not seen as a person. She was seen as an opportunity. So she kept the rifle loaded. She kept the door bolted. And she had stopped apologizing for either. The stranger on the other side of the gate was tall, broader through the shoulders than most men she'd seen come through this county, with a dark coat that had seen too many winters and a jaw that hadn't met a razor in weeks. His horse stood behind him, blowing steam into the freezing air. He had one hand resting easy near his side, not reaching for anything, not moving, just standing there in the last gray light of an afternoon that was turning ugly fast. "I said step back," Clara told him. "Yes, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, like a man who had learned long ago that raising it didn't help anything. "I heard you the first time." "Then why are you still standing there?" "Because your mare's got her leg caught in the fence wire on the north side of the pasture, and if she keeps pulling the way she was pulling when I came up the road, she's going to tear that leg open before you can get to her. Figured you'd want to know." Clara didn't lower the rifle, but something shifted behind her eyes. She had not checked the north pasture since noon. She hadn't had time. There was ice to break in the water trough, a leak in the roof. She'd been trying to patch with rags and prayer, and a stack of firewood that had gone from worrying to terrifying in the last 2 days. Nell, her best mare, had been restless all morning. She had told herself it was the coming storm. "How do you know about my mare?" "Rode past your fence line on the way down from the pass. Saw her from the road." He tilted his head slightly, just enough to gesture toward the north. "She's been down there for a while. Ground around her is churned up pretty good." Clara's jaw tightened. Every part of her wanted to keep the gun exactly where it was and tell this man to get back on his horse and ride. Every instinct she'd developed since James died was screaming at her that a stranger who showed up at a widow's gate right before a blizzard was not there out of the goodness of his heart. But Nell. She couldn't lose Nell. "You stay right there," Clara said, and she meant it with everything she had. "You move 1 inch toward this cabin, I will not ask you twice." "Understood," he said, and his tone told her he meant it too. She backed toward the cabin door, keeping the rifle trained on him until she was inside. She grabbed her wool coat off the hook, stuffed her feet into her boots, and came back out onto the porch still holding the Winchester. She kept her eyes on him as she moved around the side of the fence toward the north pasture, and he stood exactly where she'd left him, not moving, not trying to follow. She found Nell 30 yards out, exactly where he said she'd be. The mare had gotten her right foreleg tangled in a section of fence wire that had come loose from its post. One of the dozen repairs Clara had been putting off because there was only one of her and too many things breaking at once. Nell was down on her side, breathing hard, eyes wild with panic, the wire biting deeper every time she struggled. Clara's stomach dropped. She put the rifle against the fence post and knelt down in the snow beside the horse's head. "Easy, girl, easy." She ran her hand along Nell's neck, feeling the muscle trembling underneath. "I've got you. Hold still." But she could see immediately that she couldn't do it alone. The wire had twisted in a way that needed 2 sets of hands, one to hold the leg steady and one to work the wire loose without cutting into the flesh any further. She had pliers in the barn. She did not have anyone to help her hold a terrified 800-pound mare. She looked back toward the gate. The stranger was still standing there, watching her, still not moving. Clara picked up the rifle. "Can you work fence wire?" she called out. "Yes, ma'am." "You touch anything on this property except that wire, and the deal is off." "Yes, ma'am." "I mean it." "I believe you," he said. And somehow that was the right answer. Not "I understand," or "of course," or any of the smooth reassurances that men offered when they were trying to get something from her. Just "I believe you." Like he had looked at her and accepted exactly what she was telling him. She jerked her chin toward the pasture. "Come help me." He came through the gate without another word, crossed the distance between them in long, steady strides, and crouched down beside Nell without any of the theater she'd half expected. No dramatic assessment of the situation, no telling her what he was about to do, like she was too simple to figure it out herself. He just looked at the wire, looked at the horse, and said, "I'll hold her leg. You get the pliers." She didn't argue. She ran for the barn and came back in under 2 minutes. He had Nell's foreleg steadied between his hands, talking to the horse in a low, continuous murmur that Clara couldn't make out, but that seemed to be working because the mare had stopped fighting. Clara worked the pliers onto the wire and started carefully unwinding it, and he held the leg absolutely still, even when Nell flinched and tried to pull away. It took 11 minutes. Clara counted them, because counting things was how she kept herself from falling apart. When the last loop of wire came free, Nell lurched to her feet and stood trembling, favoring the leg but upright. Clara ran her hand down the foreleg, checking for deep cuts. The skin was abraded and raw, but not severed. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "She'll be sore," the stranger said, straightening up and brushing snow off his knees. "Might want to get her into the barn before this storm breaks. Keep her still for a few days." "I know how to care for my own horse," Clara said. "You do," he agreed, without any edge to it. She looked at him. He was already stepping back, giving her space, not pressing in or making himself comfortable or acting like helping with the wire meant he'd earned something. He just stood there in the gray afternoon light, with his coat dusted in snow and his hands easy at his sides. "What do you want?" Clara asked. The question came out harder than she intended, but she didn't take it back. "I don't want anything," he said. "Everybody wants something." He looked at her for a moment. Not the way men usually looked at her. Not assessing, not pitying, not calculating. Just looking. The way you looked at something you were trying to understand. "I was riding past, saw the horse, stopped." He lifted one shoulder. "That's the whole of it. Men don't just stop. I did," he said simply. Then he looked up at the sky, where the clouds had turned the particular shade of gray that meant the storm wasn't a possibility anymore. It was a certainty. "You've got bigger problems than the mare, ma'am, if you don't mind me saying." Clara followed his gaze without meaning to. Then she looked back at the cabin, at the porch, at the pathetically small pile of firewood stacked against the wall. A day's worth, maybe less. And she'd been telling herself for a week that she'd get to the woodpile, and she hadn't gotten to it because there was always something else falling apart first. She had been cold for 3 days. Not the kind of cold you feel on your skin, the kind that settles into your bones and doesn't move because the fire is never quite hot enough, and you never quite sleep warm enough, and you wake up every morning thinking, "Today, I will fix this," and then today comes and goes, and it is not fixed. She was so tired. She had not admitted that to a single living soul in 8 months, because admitting it felt like proving everyone right. All the people in town who had looked at her after James died with that particular mixture of sympathy and satisfaction, like they had always known a woman alone couldn't hold a piece of land, couldn't run a ranch, couldn't manage. She had spent 8 months being ferociously, exhaustingly capable in the face of every disaster this land threw at her, because the alternative was giving those people what they were waiting for. But the woodpile was nearly gone, and the storm was coming, and there was a man standing in her pasture who had just helped her save her horse and hadn't asked for anything in return. "The woodpile's around the back," Clara said finally. She kept her voice flat and practical, the way she kept everything now. "If you're offering to cut wood, I'm not going to stop you." Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. "I'll get to it." "I didn't say thank you," she warned him. "You didn't have to," he said. His name, she learned 20 minutes later when she brought him a cup of water and stood at enough distance to make her intentions clear, was Elias Carter. He had come down out of the mountains from a trapping line he ran in the high country, heading toward Millhaven to resupply before the weather closed the pass. He offered this information without decoration, the way a man offered facts when he had nothing to hide and no particular interest in making himself sound better than he was. Clara listened from the porch while he worked, watching the axe rise and fall with the efficient rhythm of a man who had done this 10,000 times. He didn't talk while he worked, which she respected. He didn't try to make conversation or ask her questions, which she respected more. He just cut wood, and the pile against the cabin wall grew, and the sky got darker and heavier, and the temperature dropped another 5 degrees. When the first real flakes started to fall, not the decorative kind, but the serious kind, heavy and sideways and meaning business, Elias set down the axe and stacked the last of what he'd cut. He had been at it for the better part of 2 hours. The pile was substantial, more than she'd had in weeks. "Storm's coming in hard," he said, looking at the sky with the calm assessment of a man who'd seen a lot of hard weather. "You've got enough wood to last a few days if you're careful with it." "Yes," Clara said. "I can see that." He nodded once. He walked to where his horse was tied at the gate and began checking his gear. He was going to leave. She could see it in the way he moved, purposeful, methodical, a man who had finished one thing and was preparing for the next. The wind hit her face, and she felt how cold the air had turned in just the last hour. She thought about Elias Carter riding out into that. She thought about the pass above Millhaven, which she knew from experience became impassable in serious snow, and this storm had the look of serious snow written all across the sky. She thought about sitting alone in the cabin tonight, with the wind screaming through every gap in the walls, with the fire finally burning hot enough to be warm, with the dinner she had made that morning and could not eat because eating alone had started to feel like one more small defeat. Clara Whitmore had not asked anyone for anything since James died. She had made that decision deliberately, in the first horrible week after the funeral, when she had understood with absolute clarity that the only person she could count on was herself. Asking meant depending. Depending meant being vulnerable. And she was never going to be vulnerable again in front of anyone who might use it against her. But Elias Carter had held her horse's leg in the snow without being asked. He had cut 2 hours of firewood without being asked. He had not looked at her once the way men looked at women they planned to take advantage of. And the storm was coming. "Mr. Carter," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. He turned from his horse. "The pass will be closed by morning," she said. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a softening. It was a statement of fact, because facts were the only currency she trusted anymore. "You won't make it to Millhaven tonight." He looked at her, waiting. "I've got a pot of stew on the stove," Clara said. "It's not much, but it's hot." The silence between them stretched out long enough that she heard the wind shift direction, and the first real gust hit the side of the barn. "Can you stay for dinner?" she asked. She said it the way she did everything now, like the words cost her nothing. Like she wasn't standing there with her heart beating hard in her chest. Like the simple act of asking another human being to sit at her table wasn't one of the hardest things she'd done in 8 months. She kept her chin level and her eyes direct, and her face showed nothing that she didn't intend to show. But her hands, inside the pockets of her wool coat, were gripped together hard enough to hurt. Elias Carter looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the storm coming down off the mountains. He looked back at her. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "I believe I will." He tied his horse in the barn next to Nell and gave both animals feed from her supply, which Clara noted without comment because it was practical and she would have done the same. She had already set a second bowl on the table before he came inside, which she also did not comment on because she had made that decision and she was done second-guessing herself. When Elias stepped through the cabin door, he took his hat off with both hands, the way men were raised to do in the presence of a woman, and he looked around the room with the quiet attention of someone reading a place. The cast-iron stove going strong now, the single lantern burning on the table, the threadbare curtains on the one window, the Bible on the shelf next to the photograph of James in his good coat. He took all of it in without saying anything, and then he sat in the chair she indicated and set his hat on his knee and waited. Clara ladled stew into both bowls. It was venison, because venison was what she had. She had shot the deer herself 3 weeks ago, and she was still not entirely used to what she was capable of now that she had no choice but to be capable. She sat down across from him. The wind outside had picked up to a howl. Inside the cabin, the stove crackled, and the lantern threw orange light across the table, and there was hot food, and 2 people who had run as far as they could from everything that had broken them. "Thank you for the horse," Clara said finally, because it needed to be said. "You'd have gotten her out," Elias replied. He meant it. She could hear that he meant it. "Eventually," she admitted, which was more honesty than she'd offered anyone in a long time. "Maybe not in time." He nodded and lifted his spoon. "Mr. Carter," she said. He looked at her. "I should tell you something." She kept her eyes on him, steady and direct. "My husband has been dead for 8 months. I have been managing this ranch alone for those 8 months. I have had 4 different men in that time ride up to this property and offer to help me, and every one of them was looking for something. My land, my deed, my compliance, my gratitude in whatever form they thought they were owed it." She paused. "I don't know what you're looking for, but I want you to understand that I am watching, and I am not as alone out here as I might appear." Elias set his spoon down. He looked at her with those quiet, steady eyes, and he said, "Mrs. Whitmore, I cut your wood because it needed cutting. I helped your horse because she needed help. I came inside because you asked me to, and the storm is real and I am cold." He picked his spoon back up. "I'm not looking for anything. I hope the stew is hot." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at her bowl and picked up her own spoon. "It is," she said. Outside, the storm broke over the Montana Territory with everything it had. Wind driving snow sideways across the valley, the temperature dropping faster than a stone dropped in a well, the kind of cold that made the world contract down to whatever small warm space you could find and hold on to. The pass above Millhaven closed within the hour. The road south turned to nothing. Inside the cabin, 2 people who had both decided that solitude was safer than hope sat across from each other and ate hot stew in the light of a single lantern. Clara told him about the fences that needed fixing along the eastern boundary. She said it the way she said everything, matter of fact, like a list of problems being reported rather than a life being confided. She told him about the roof section over the back bedroom that leaked when the snow melted, and the north gate that had needed a new hinge for 3 months, and the 2 heifers that had gone missing in November that she suspected had been taken. Elias listened. He didn't offer solutions she hadn't asked for. He didn't tell her what she should have done differently. He listened the way people listened when they actually intended to hear what was being said, and he asked 2 questions, both of them practical, both of them suggesting that he understood something about the mechanics of running a working ranch. And she answered them without thinking too carefully about why a man she had met 3 hours ago was the first person in 8 months she had told any of this to. She thought she knew the answer. She thought the answer was simply that he hadn't tried to take anything from her yet. And after 8 months of defending everything she had from people who thought her grief made her an easy mark, the absence of threat felt close enough to safety that she had let her guard down by a fraction. Just a fraction. She was still watching. "What about you?" she asked, when she had run out of practical things to report. She asked it the way she asked everything, bluntly, without softening. "You said you come down from the mountains." "Yes, ma'am." "Where do you go when you come down?" "Nowhere in particular." He said it without any self-pity, which she appreciated. It was the same way she talked about things that were simply true. "Millhaven for supplies. Sometimes Billings if I need more than Millhaven has, then back up." "Every year?" "Every year since the war." She looked at him. She did not ask which war, because she knew. Every man who looked like him and sounded like him had been shaped by the same war, one way or another. "How long ago was the war?" 16 years, he said. The way he said it told her that he did not consider 16 years to be a particularly long time. She thought about asking him what he had lost. She decided against it because she knew what it felt like to have a stranger decide your grief was something they were entitled to know about. She had answered enough questions about James, fielded enough of the town's careful, terrible sympathy, been asked enough times what she was going to do now, as though James's death was primarily a practical problem she needed to solve. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to tell me," she said instead. He looked at her across the table. Something shifted in his expression, something brief and real, not performed. "No," he said quietly. "I don't suppose I do." They sat with that for a moment. "My husband's name was James," Clara said. Not because he had asked, not because she owed him anything, but because it was the first time in 8 months that she had said James's name in a room with another person who hadn't immediately followed it with something that was supposed to make her feel better. He was 34 years old. He was a decent man. He was not a perfect man, but he was decent, and he didn't deserve what happened to him. Elias said nothing. He just looked at her and waited, and that was the right thing. She could feel that it was the right thing. "Men came for the cattle," she said. 3 of them, middle of the night in August. James went out to stop them, and they shot him, rode off with 11 head, and left him in the dirt by the gate. Her voice was perfectly steady. She had told this story enough times in those first days that the steadiness had become automatic, a kind of armor she'd built over the wound. Nobody went after them. The sheriff said he couldn't leave town. The men who might have helped wanted compensation I didn't have, so they got away. She looked down at her bowl. "They're still out there." "I know," Elias said. She looked up sharply. "Not the men specifically," he said, "but I know the kind of men. I've been in enough frontier country to know how it goes." He paused. "And I know they don't always stay away." Clara held his gaze. "No," she said. "They don't." The fire crackled. The storm howled. The lantern flame bent in a draft and straightened again. "I've been waiting," Clara said quietly, and she hadn't meant to say it. It slipped out past the armor, the way things did when you were too tired to keep every gate closed. "Every night since August. I sleep with the rifle on the floor beside the bed. I listen to every sound." She stopped herself. She looked at the table. "I'm not afraid of them," she said firmly, bringing the armor back up. "I want to be clear about that. I am not afraid." "No," Elias said. "I can see that. But I'm—" She stopped again. "Tired," he offered. Not pityingly, just quietly, the way you named something true. She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said at last. "I am very tired." Outside, the storm screamed across the valley and piled snow against every wall and door. Inside, the stove burned hot and steady, and the single lantern held the dark at bay, and the stew was long since gone, but neither of them had moved to clear the table. Clara Whitmore, who had not admitted to being tired to a single human being since the morning James died, sat across from a stranger who had cut her wood and freed her horse and eaten her dinner, and said nothing she needed to defend herself against. And for the first time in 8 months, the silence inside 4 walls did not feel like something she was simply enduring. Elias Carter sat with his hat on his knee, and the fire reflected in his dark eyes, and thought about the past that was already buried under 2 feet of snow, and the mountain he would have been climbing toward in the morning, and the empty camp at the top of it, where he had been spending his winters alone for going on a decade now. He thought about what he had left up there. He thought about what was here. He had not intended to stop when he saw the mare. He had not intended to cut wood. He had not intended to stay for dinner. He was not entirely sure what he intended anymore. But he was warm, for the first time in longer than he wanted to think about. And there was a woman across the table from him who had looked at him with the most honest eyes he had seen in 16 years and said, "I am very tired," like it was the most revolutionary thing she had ever admitted to. And he understood that. God help him. He understood that, down to the marrow. The storm rattled the window glass. Elias looked at the woman across the table and thought, "You have been alone out here long enough." He did not say it. He said, "You mind if I look at that roof section before I turn in? I can see from here where it's been patched. If the snow load gets heavy enough tonight, that patch won't hold." Clara looked at him. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were measuring. Every instinct she had was checking him over one more time, looking for the angle, the ask, the thing that was going to come next. She found nothing. "There's a ladder in the barn," she said finally. "Mind your step on the rungs. Third one from the bottom is cracked." "I'll watch it," he said. He got up from the table and put on his coat, and Clara sat and listened to him go out into the storm and come back in through the back of the cabin. Listened to the sounds of a man moving carefully and deliberately overhead, the creak of the roof under his weight, the muffled sounds of work being done. She cleared the bowls from the table. She added a log to the fire. She thought about the last 8 months. She thought about every morning she had gotten out of bed and done what needed to be done because there was no one else to do it. She thought about the nights she had lain awake with the rifle beside her and the cold settling into the cabin, and told herself this was strength, this self-sufficiency, this absolute refusal to need anyone. And she thought about the fact that in 3 hours, this stranger had done more to help her ranch survive the winter than 4 months of her own exhausted effort had managed. That wasn't something she was going to say out loud, but she let herself think it. Elias came back down from the roof 20 minutes later, brushing snow off his shoulders, and looked at her with those calm, serious eyes. "Reinforced it best I can with what was up there. Should hold tonight. You'll want someone to do a proper repair come spring." "I'll manage it," Clara said. "I don't doubt it," he said, and he meant it. She could hear it in his voice. And somehow that was harder to take than anything else he had said all evening, because most people said "I don't doubt it" the way you placated someone you absolutely doubted. He didn't. He looked at her like a woman who had been managing and would keep managing, and the only thing he was saying was that the roof would hold tonight. Clara showed him the small room off the back where she kept stored supplies, where there was a narrow cot she had not touched since a cousin had last visited 2 years ago. She brought him an extra blanket without being asked. She stood in the doorway and said, "Storm should blow through by morning. You can rest for the night." It was not "you are welcome here." It was not "I want you to stay." It was a practical statement about weather and hospitality and nothing else. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore," Elias said. "Clara," she said. She didn't know why she said it. It was out before she could stop it. "Just Clara is fine." He looked at her. "Good night, Clara," he said quietly. She turned and walked back to the main room and stood by the stove with her hands pressed flat against the warm iron and her eyes closed. Outside, the worst blizzard of the year buried the Montana Territory under 2 feet of snow and sealed every road and pass in the region. Inside, for the first time in 8 months, Clara Whitmore was not alone. She stood there for a long time before she let herself think about what that meant. And in the small back room, Elias Carter lay on the narrow cot and stared at the ceiling and listened to the storm and thought about the mountain that was buried under that same storm, and the empty camp waiting for him up there, and the life he had built around the single principle that isolation was the only thing that never hurt you. He had believed that for 16 years. He wasn't entirely sure he believed it tonight. The fire burned on in the other room. The snow piled up outside every window. And somewhere in the cold, dark heart of Montana Territory, in the worst winter in a decade, 2 people who had decided that being alone was the only safe way to lay awake, listening to the same storm and thinking, separately and without admitting it to themselves or anyone else, that perhaps they had been wrong. Elias was still asleep when Clara got up. She knew because she had lain awake long enough listening to the silence from the back room to be certain of it. A silence that was different from the silence she had lived with for 8 months. Heavier somehow, occupied. The kind of silence that meant another person was breathing in it. She had not slept well. She had not expected to. She had lain in her own bed with the rifle on the floor beside her, and the wind hammering the walls, and told herself she was being practical and reasonable, and that none of what she was feeling was anything other than the completely understandable wariness of a woman who had let a stranger sleep under her roof. She got up before first light and built the fire up from coals and put water on to boil and stood at the stove in the dark and tried not to think too carefully about any of it. She heard him when he woke, the creak of the cot, the deliberate quiet of a man trying not to disturb anyone, boots being pulled on without a single unnecessary sound. She heard him cross the back room and stop at the door. "Morning," he said from the doorway. "Coffee's on," she said without turning around. She heard him sit down at the table. She heard him wait. She poured 2 cups and brought them over and set one in front of him, and took her own chair, and they sat across from each other in the dark cabin with the fire going, and the storm reduced overnight to a steady cold wind, and neither of them said anything for a while. It should have been uncomfortable. Clara had prepared herself for uncomfortable, for the awkwardness of mourning, for a man who had slept in her house trying to recalibrate what that meant, trying to negotiate the mourning into something that served him. She had her answers ready. She had her distance ready. But Elias picked up his coffee with both hands and looked at the table and didn't say anything. And after a minute, Clara realized that it wasn't uncomfortable at all. It was just quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't need filling. "Storm's through," he said finally, still looking at the table. "Yes. Pass might be clear enough by afternoon." "Might be," she agreed. He nodded. He drank his coffee. "Roof held," he said. "I noticed." She paused. "Thank you." He looked up then, and something in his expression caught her off guard. Not surprise exactly, but close to it. Like he hadn't expected to hear it and didn't quite know what to do with it. She filed that away without comment. "I'll check the fence along the north before I go," he said. "The section that caught your mare. The wire's loose for about 20 yards on either side. Won't take long." Clara looked at him across the table. She looked at him the way she looked at everything now, taking the full measure, not letting anything slide past just because she wanted it to. He looked back at her steadily, and there was nothing in his face she could find to object to. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm going to anyway." She should have told him no. She had a whole architecture of reasons why she should have told him no. Reasons about self-reliance and not letting anyone think they had a claim here, and not building habits around a man who was going to ride away up the mountain and not come back. She knew all those reasons. She had built them carefully over 8 months. She said, "There are biscuits, if you're hungry." He almost smiled. Not quite, but close enough that she could see the shape of it. "I'd be grateful," he said. They ate breakfast in the same quiet they'd had with the coffee, and Clara found herself paying attention to small things she had no business paying attention to. The way he held his cup. The way he listened to the sounds of the morning outside without seeming restless. The way he didn't try to take up more space than he occupied. James had been a talker in the mornings. She had loved that about him. That running commentary on the day ahead. The way he'd lay out his plans like a map while she was still waking up. She had not realized until this moment how thoroughly she had retrained herself to find comfort in silence. Elias finished his biscuit and stood up and put on his coat without a word. And Clara stood too, because she was not the kind of woman who sent men out to work her land while she sat by the fire. She put on her own coat and followed him out into the cold, bright morning. The snow had come down hard enough to change the shape of everything. The fence lines were buried to the 3rd rail in some places. The barn roof had collected 2 feet of white weight that was going to need clearing before it became a problem. The north pasture was a flat, unbroken field of white, except where the posts broke through. Elias had his tools out before she'd crossed the yard. He moved through the snow with the efficiency of a man who wasn't wasting any motion, reading the fence line the way she imagined he read terrain, not with his eyes only, but with some whole-body attention that registered everything at once. "Here," he said, at a spot 40 yards from where Nell had gone down. He crouched and dug snow away from the base of the post. "This one's rotted through at the ground. Wind gets into a post like this, and the whole section'll come down." He looked up at her. "You got a spare post?" "In the barn," she said. "Back left corner." I went and got it without asking her to show him where, which she appreciated. And when he came back, she was already digging out the old post with the spade she'd grabbed from beside the barn door. He looked at her when he got back. Not surprised, not the faintly insulting, impressed expression men wore when they discovered she was competent. Just matter of fact, like he'd expected to find her already working, and found her already working. They reset the post together. It was hard work, cold work, the kind that required two sets of hands and not a lot of conversation. And that turned out to be fine, because neither of them needed conversation. She held the post level while he packed the ground around it, and then he held the wire while she worked the staples, and it went the way it went yesterday with the mare. Two people working the same problem without needing to negotiate every step. Clara had forgotten what that felt like. Working alongside someone who didn't need to be taught or led or managed, who read the work the same way she read it and met her where she was. James had been that. In the beginning, before the hard years wore him thin, James had been exactly that. She drove the last staple and stood up and looked at the repaired section and told herself firmly that she was not going to let herself feel whatever it was she was starting to feel. "There's another section about 50 yards east," she said, keeping her voice practical. "And the east gate's been dragging since October. Hinge needs replacing." Elias looked at her. He looked at the fence line stretching east. He looked at the sky, which was clear and cold, and suggested the pass would be open by early afternoon. "Show me the gate," he said. She showed him the gate. The morning passed in work. Real, physical, necessary work that left no room for anything she didn't want to think about. They replaced the hinge on the east gate. They cleared the barn roof before the snow load could do damage. They checked on Nell, whose leg was stiff and sore but clean, and on the other 3 horses, and on the small herd of cattle that had clustered in the south corner of the pasture, and were regarding the 2 humans with the mild, long-suffering patience of animals who have endured worse. Clara counted the cattle while Elias ran his eye over the fence line of the south pasture. She counted again. "I'm short," she said. It came out flat. "How many?" "2. Should be 14. I'm counting 12. She walked the south fence, scanning the pasture, checking the far corners. "They're not here." "When did you last count?" 2 days ago. 14. Elias was already moving along the fence, reading it the way he'd read the north section, low, methodical, checking post by post. She went the other direction, and they met at the southeast corner, where the fence ran up against a shallow rise. The wire was cut. Not broken, not pulled loose by a heavy animal or rotted through by weather. Cut. Clean cuts, 3 strands, pulled back and tied off against the post, so they'd hold long enough for someone to move cattle through without leaving obvious evidence right away. Clara stood looking at it. Her hands had stopped being cold. Everything had stopped being cold. "They came back," she said. Her voice was absolutely level. She said it the way she said the roof held and the storms through. One more fact about the world. But her knuckles were white around the fence post she was holding. Elias crouched and looked at the cut ends of the wire. He didn't say anything right away. He touched the metal, looked at the ground, read whatever it was men like him, rid in disturbed earth and cut wire and the tracks that were half filled in by last night's snow, but not entirely gone. "2 men," he said, "maybe 3, came in after dark, before the snow got heavy. These tracks have fill." He straightened up and looked at her. "They knew where your fence was weak." "They've been here before," Clara said. "Yes. They killed my husband." "I know." She looked at him. There was something building in her chest. Not fear, she refused to call it fear. Something harder than fear, something with edges. "They took 2 of my cattle last night while I was sitting inside drinking coffee with a stranger." She didn't mean it as an accusation. She said it because it was true, and she needed to say it, and she was past the point of managing how things landed. Elias took it without flinching. "Yes," he said again, and there was something in the single word that told her he understood exactly what it cost her to say that, and that he wasn't going to try to talk her out of feeling it. "I should have been checking," she said. "The storm was—" "Don't," she said sharply. "Don't do that. Don't make it reasonable. I should have been checking." He closed his mouth. He looked at her and waited. She stood at the cut fence in the cold morning and breathed through it. The fury and the helplessness and the particular grief of a woman who had been working herself to the bone to hold this land and was still losing it piece by piece, animal by animal, to men who had decided she didn't deserve to keep it. "How far?" she said finally. "How far ahead are they?" 8 hours, give or take. Storm covered most of it. "Direction?" He studied the tracks again, the direction of the disturbed snow, the way the fence had been pulled back. North, maybe northeast. There's a canyon system up that way. I know it. Plenty of places to hold cattle and wait for things to quiet down. She looked at him. She looked at this man who had showed up at her gate yesterday with quiet eyes and no particular agenda, and had spent the last 12 hours fixing her fences and eating her food and sleeping in her spare room, and who was now crouching over the tracks of the men who had killed her husband. "How well do you know that canyon?" she asked. He looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, all 18 hours of it, something moved through his expression that wasn't quite calm, something that recognized what she was asking. "Well enough," he said. "Would you know how to find where they're holding cattle?" "Clara, would you know?" He stood up slowly. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, and then he said quietly, "You can't go up there." She felt her chin come up before she could stop it. "I beg your pardon?" "I'm not saying you're not capable," he said, and his voice was careful and deliberate, like a man stepping across a surface he wasn't sure of. "I'm saying 2 men with cattle and guns in canyon country against a woman on horseback alone. The numbers don't work, Clara, even for someone capable." "Then don't let me go alone," she said. The silence that followed was long enough that she could hear the wind moving across the snow. Elias looked at the cut fence. He looked at the tracks leading north. He looked at the sky, at the pass that would be open by afternoon, at the route back up to the mountain and the empty camp, and the 10 years of solitude he had built brick by careful brick around himself. "Those are your cattle," she said. Not pleading, not soft, just true. "I know it," he said. "My husband is dead because of men like those. I know that too." "Then you know I can't just let them ride away again." His jaw tightened. She could see the muscle working in it. She could see him wrestling with something. Not whether to help her, she didn't think, but something more complicated than that. Something about himself and what he was willing to become again. "If we go up there," he said slowly, "and we find them, it won't be a conversation, Clara. You understand that. Men who cut fence and take cattle and shoot the man who comes out to stop them don't have conversations." "I know what they are," she said. "You've never—" He stopped. "I've never what?" she said, and her voice was very quiet. He looked at her. "I've seen a lot of people who thought they were ready for what comes after the talking stops. Most of them weren't. My husband was 34 years old," she said, and she said it the way she'd said it last night. Level, armored, every word placed deliberately. "He was decent. He went out to protect what was ours, and they shot him in the dirt and rode away, and nobody did a single thing about it." She paused. "I am not going to stand at this fence and watch them do it again." Elias looked at her for a long time. Then he looked north. Then he looked back at her, and something had settled in his face. Some decision made in the place where decisions actually happen, below the level of words. "Can you ride hard?" he said. "Yes." "You'll do what I say when I say it, without arguing?" She opened her mouth. "Clara." His voice was level. "I'm not questioning your judgment. I'm saying 2 people in canyon country need to move as one. If I say down, you go down. If I say back, you go back. Not because you couldn't figure it out yourself, because a half-second lag in broken terrain is how people get killed." She thought about it. She hated that he was right, and she could hear that he was right, and that was not a comfortable thing. "Agreed," she said. "Then go saddle your horse." She went. She was back out in 12 minutes with her horse saddled and the Winchester loaded, and a canteen and 2 days of food in her saddlebag, because she had been running this ranch alone long enough to know that preparation was not pessimism, it was survival. Elias looked at the saddlebag and gave one brief nod that told her the preparation was right, and then they rode north. The canyon country above Clara's ranch was terrain that would have turned most riders back, narrow passages between rock walls, false trails that dead-ended in drops, the kind of landscape that rewarded people who knew it and punished people who didn't. Elias knew it. She could see that from the way he moved through it, choosing routes without hesitation, reading the land with a confidence that wasn't arrogance, Just knowledge accumulated through years of moving through places where getting it wrong meant not getting back. Clara rode beside him where she could, and behind him where she had to, and kept her mouth shut and watched everything, because watching was what she did. They rode for 2 hours before Elias raised his hand. She stopped her horse. He stopped his. He sat completely still, reading something in the terrain ahead that she couldn't see yet. Then she smelled it. Smoke. The thin, careful smoke of a small fire kept deliberately low. "Quarter mile," he said, barely above a murmur. "There's a box canyon through that break. Good place to hold cattle overnight." "How many times have you been through here?" "Enough." He looked at her. "3 men, I think. The tracks clarified coming up. There's a third set I missed in the snow. Could be more." He paused. "Clara, I'm here. When we come in, you take the right side. Stay behind the rock until I've got their attention. Don't step out until they've made their choice. Their choice. Whether to reach or to stand." His eyes were steady on hers. "If they stand, we handle it without shooting. If they reach—" "I understand," she said. He looked at her one more second longer, like he was checking one final time whether she meant it. She met his eyes and did not look away. They left the horses tied back in the rocks and went the last quarter mile on foot, moving through the broken terrain with the particular careful quiet of people who understood that noise had consequences. Clara moved better than she expected, not as silently as Elias, but close, and she could see from the brief glance he threw back at her once that he had noticed. They came around the rock face and the box canyon opened up in front of them, and there were the cattle, her cattle, 12 of them pressed against the far wall. And there were 3 men around a small fire, and there were 3 horses tied nearby, and everything was exactly as Elias had read it. One of the men looked up. It was the speed of it that Clara remembered afterward. The way everything shifted from still to violent in less time than it took to think. The man who looked up was already reaching before he'd fully registered what he was seeing, and Elias was already moving, crossing the distance at a pace that didn't seem possible for a man his size, and Clara stepped out from the right side of the rock face with the Winchester leveled before the second man had finished getting to his feet. "Don't," she said. The word came out of her in a voice she didn't quite recognize. Not louder than usual, not aggressive, just absolutely, completely certain. The kind of voice that had no room in it for doubt. The second man froze. The third man, by the fire, had not moved at all. He was older than the other 2, gray-bearded, heavy, with the particular stillness of someone who had survived enough situations to know when moving fast was the wrong choice. He looked at Clara. He looked at Elias, who had the first man's arm bent behind him in a grip that suggested very clearly the consequences of continued movement. Then the old man looked back at Clara. "Who are you?" he said. "Clara Whitmore," she said. "You killed my husband in August." She watched his face when she said it. She watched what happened there, the flicker of recognition, the brief recalculation, and then something she hadn't expected, something that looked, for just a moment, like shame. He covered it fast, but she had seen it. "Now," she said, "you're going to tell me exactly where to find whoever hired you. And then you're going to help me drive my cattle home." The old man looked at her for a long time. "Ma'am," he said finally, and his voice had dropped some of its bluster. "You got no idea what you're walking into." "I know exactly what I'm walking into," Clara said. "You're going to tell me anyway." His name was Doyle, and he talked. Not immediately. There was a stretch of time between the moment Clara leveled the rifle and the moment Doyle started talking that was tense enough to have its own weather, during which Elias secured the other 2 men with rope from his saddlebag, with the calm efficiency of someone who had done exactly this before, and the second man made one more attempt at bravado that collapsed immediately when Clara didn't move the rifle even a fraction of an inch, and the first man, who had made the mistake of reaching, was sitting in the dirt, cradling a wrist that Elias had not broken, but had come very close to breaking. Doyle watched all of it, and then he looked at Clara, at the rifle that had not wavered, and the eyes that had not wavered, and the woman who was standing in a box canyon in the mountains, having just tracked down the men who killed her husband without any evidence of being afraid. And he made his own calculation. "Man in town hired us," he said. "Goes by Marsh. Runs the land office." Clara's breath caught, but she didn't let it show on her face. The land office. Harlan Marsh, who had been the first person at her door after James died, offering condolences, and then, in the same breath, offering to take the deed off her hands because clearly a woman alone couldn't manage, offering her a price that was half what the land was worth, delivered with a smile that suggested she should be grateful for it. Who had shown up again in October with an updated offer and a slightly less sympathetic expression. Who had sent a man by in November with paperwork she had not signed. Harlan Marsh, who ran the land office. "He hired you to take the cattle," Clara said. "He hired us to make things difficult," Doyle said. "Figured if we took enough, you'd sell. August was—" He stopped. He looked at the ground. August got out of hand. The husband wasn't supposed to be armed. Clara's grip on the Winchester tightened hard enough that she felt it in her shoulder. She did not pull the trigger. She thought about pulling the trigger. She breathed through it. One breath, two. And then she said, very quietly, "August got out of hand." "Yes, ma'am." "My husband is dead because August got out of hand." "Yes, ma'am." Something in Doyle's voice had gone rough. He was not a good man. She could see that plainly. But he was a man sitting with what he had done, and it was heavier than he had expected. "You're going to ride to Millhaven," Clara said. "You're going to walk into the sheriff's office, and you're going to say everything you just told me. Names, dates, the order from Marsh. Everything." She paused. "And if you don't, Mr. Carter and I are going to find you again, and the conversation we have next time will be considerably shorter." Doyle looked at Elias, who was standing to one side with his arms crossed and an expression of complete, absolute composure. "She means it," Elias said. "I can see that," Doyle said. The ride back down from the canyon took 3 hours with the cattle, moving slow through the broken terrain. Clara rode behind the herd with the Winchester still in her hand, and Elias rode point, and the 3 men rode in front of him and did not look back more than twice. When they reached the valley road, Elias cut them loose, sent them east toward Millhaven with a look that communicated very clearly what would happen if they chose a different direction. They chose Millhaven. Clara watched them go. When they were out of sight, she sat on her horse in the cold afternoon light and let herself feel, for just a moment, the full weight of everything that had just happened. The cut fence and the stolen cattle, and Doyle's voice saying, August got out of hand, and Harlan Marsh's name landing in her chest like a stone she'd suspected was there, but hadn't been sure of until now. She let herself feel it, and then she squared her shoulders and looked at Elias, who was watching her with that patient, quiet attention she was starting to recognize as his version of concern. "Marsh," she said. "Yes." "He's not going to stop because 3 hired men walked into the sheriff's office." "No," Elias agreed. "He won't. He wants the land. He's been wanting it since James died. He'll find another way to come at me." "He will." She looked at the road to Millhaven. She looked at her cattle moving back toward the home pasture. She looked at the land around her land, James's land, the land she had been killing herself to hold for 8 months against something she had only half understood until today. "I need proof," she said. "Yes." "Documentation. Something I can take to someone above the sheriff. Someone Marsh can't get to." "There are land records," Elias said. "If he's been manipulating deeds and claims in this county, there'll be a pattern. Federal Land Office would have copies." He paused. "You'd need someone to help you look." Clara looked at him. He looked back at her. "The pass is open," she said carefully. "You could still make Millhaven by evening." "I could," he said. "You have a supply run to make." "I do." She looked at her hands on the reins. She looked at the herd moving south. She said, very carefully, "I could also use help moving those cattle back through the south gate and into the near pasture before the temperature drops." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That'll take a couple hours." "Probably," she agreed. "Might as well stay for dinner after, since it'll be too late to make the pass." Clara looked at him. He was not quite smiling, but the shape of it was there again, warmer this time, less careful. "I suppose it might be," she said. "That's 2 dinners now, ma'am," he said, and this time the shape of the smile made it all the way. "Don't push it, Mr. Carter," she said, and she turned her horse and rode after the cattle, and after a moment she heard him follow. But she was not entirely sure she had hidden, in the turning, the fact that the corner of her own mouth had moved. They got the cattle through the gate as the light went flat and gold, and they did it without conversation, because they had learned already how to work the same problem. And when the last animal was through and the gate was latched, Clara stood with her hands on the top rail and looked at the herd and thought about James, who had loved these animals the way some men loved horses, with a seriousness that she had sometimes teased him about. She thought about what Doyle had said. August got out of hand. She thought about Harlan Marsh sitting in the land office in Millhaven right now, not knowing that his hired men were walking toward the sheriff's office, not knowing that she knew his name, not knowing that the woman he had been trying to push off this land for 8 months had spent this morning climbing into Canyon Country to take back what was hers. She thought about what came next. "He's going to come at me through the law," she said. She wasn't talking to anyone in particular. She was talking to the problem, which was what she did. "He runs the land office. He knows the legal language. He's going to find something in the deed or the claim or the transfer documents that he can use as a lever." "Probably," Elias said from beside her. "Which means you need someone who knows the same language." "There's a lawyer in Billings. I know one in Helena, better one." She looked at him. He was looking at the cattle, not at her, and his voice was the same careful, practical tone he used when he was suggesting things without making them into something she hadn't asked for. "You know a lawyer in Helena," she said. "Did some work for him once, long time ago. He owes me a conversation at least." Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about what she was being offered and what it would mean to take it and what it would mean to not take it. And she thought about the last 8 months of being alone in this, with no help and too much pride, and the way that had gone. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I asked," he said. They walked back to the cabin in the cold evening, and this time it was Clara who went inside first, and Elias who came in a few minutes behind her after checking on the horses, and Clara had the stove going and the lamp lit by the time he sat down at the table, and she put water on for coffee, without asking if he wanted any, because by now she knew he did. She set the cup in front of him. She sat down across from him. She looked at this man who had ridden into Canyon Country with her today, without hesitating, who had secured 3 armed men with rope and calm and the complete absence of bluster, who had listened to Doyle name Harlan Marsh with the same still attention he gave to everything, and then said nothing that she didn't need him to say. "Why are you still here?" she asked. The question came out more nakedly than she intended. She had meant it practically. She had a list of practical reasons why someone might stay, and she had been checking them against the evidence, and the evidence kept coming up short of an explanation. But it came out past the armor, the way things had kept doing since last night, and she didn't have the energy to call it back. Elias looked at her across the table. He looked at her for long enough that she was almost sorry she had asked. Then he said, "I don't know exactly." She blinked. "I know that's not a satisfying answer," he said. "I don't have a better one right now." He picked up his coffee. He looked at the table. "I came down off that mountain because I needed supplies. I stopped at your gate because your horse was in trouble. I cut your wood because it needed cutting, and I had the time." He paused. "Everything after that." He stopped. He turned the cup in his hands. "I've spent 10 years knowing exactly where I was going and what I was doing when I got there. I didn't come down here looking for something to change." "But," Clara said quietly. He looked up at her. "There's a but," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You asked me to dinner," he said finally, and his voice was lower than usual, something stripped back in it. "First person in a long time who asked me to anything. Not because they needed something from me, or because they were pretending at kindness. Because you were alone and I was there and you were—" He stopped. "Because you asked." Clara sat very still across from him. The fire crackled. "I'm not going to pretend this is something it isn't," she said. And she chose every word carefully, because she had learned that the most dangerous thing you could do was let things be vague when they needed to be clear. I don't know what this is. I know you've been here 2 days, and you helped me do more in 2 days than I've been able to do alone in 8 months. And I know you rode up into that canyon with me this morning without blinking. And I know that means something, but I'm not. She paused. I'm not in a place to know what it means. Neither am I, Elias said. Then we're agreed, she said. On what? On the fact that neither of us knows what we're doing. She said it very directly, looking at him straight. But you're here, and I've got Harlan Marsh to deal with, and a ranch to hold, and a dead husband to answer for. And you know a lawyer in Helena. Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite something sadder, something between. I do, he said. Then stay until we figure out what needs figuring out, she said. After that, she stopped. She looked at the table. After that, we'll see. Elias looked at her across the narrow table in the lamplight, with the fire going, and the cold outside, and the whole complicated weight of two damaged people sitting in the same room, deciding whether hope was still something they were allowed to have. All right, he said quietly. I'll stay. Clara nodded once. She stood and picked up her cup and refilled it, and did not say anything else because there was nothing else that needed saying right now. And she had learned that the bravest thing you could do sometimes was to leave a thing exactly as it was and let it be enough. Outside, the Montana Territory lay frozen and still under 1 billion stars. Inside, two people who had stopped believing in second chances sat across from each other in the warm light, and did not say anything about the fact that one might have just begun. 3 days after Elias said he would stay, Harlan Marsh rode out to the ranch. Clara saw him coming from the barn, where she was checking Nell's leg. Healing well, the swelling down, the mare putting weight on it again with only a slight favoring that Elias had said would resolve in another week. She recognized Marsh's horse before she recognized the man. A big roan that he kept better than he kept most things he owned, and she felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. She came out of the barn and stood in the yard and waited. Marsh was a man who had learned to weaponize his own pleasantness. He was 60, maybe 62, with a broad face that was built for smiling, and a voice that had been carefully trained to sound like he was doing you a favor even when he was taking something away. He rode into her yard with that smile already in place, had coming off before he'd fully stopped his horse. And Clara thought about the cut fence wire, and Doyle's voice saying the land office, and she kept her face completely still. Mrs. Whitmore, Marsh said, I heard you had some trouble. Did you? Clara said. Cattle missing. Something about a break in your north fence. He shook his head with an expression of practiced concern. This country gets harder every year for folks trying to hold on alone. I've said it to the town council twice this winter. Have you? I have. He looked around the yard with an appraiser's eye. She could see him doing it, noting the repairs, the fresh-cut wood stacked high beside the cabin, the fixed east gate. Something moved briefly through his expression that wasn't quite pleasure, more like surprise, and not the good kind. He had been expecting things to look worse. Looks like you've had some help, he said. I've been managing, Clara said. Of course you have. The smile stayed exactly where it was. I've always admired your determination, Clara, since James passed. Truly. But there comes a point where determination alone. He sighed. I've had another buyer express interest in this parcel. Good people, family out of Billings, looking to expand their operation. They came to me directly, which means the offer is strong. Significantly stronger than what I brought you last time. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. I thought, as a courtesy, I should bring it to you personally rather than sending a man. He held out the paper. Clara did not take it. Marsh's smile held steady, but his arm was still extended, and she was not moving. And that particular tableau went on long enough to become its own kind of statement. I know about Doyle, Clara said. The smile didn't disappear. That was the thing about Marsh. The smile was structural, built into the architecture of his face. But something behind it changed, the way light changed in a room when a cloud moved across the sun. I'm sorry, he said. "The 3 men who cut my south fence and took 12 head of cattle 2 nights ago," Clara said. Doyle talked. His 2 men talked. "They're in Millhaven right now talking to the sheriff, and they have been talking to the sheriff since yesterday morning." She paused. "I thought, as a courtesy, I should tell you that personally, rather than letting you find out another way." Marsh lowered his arm. The paper went back into his coat. The smile finally, slowly, rearranged itself into something else, something flatter and less careful. "You don't know what you're saying," he said. His voice had lost the warm, beneficent quality. It wasn't quite threatening yet. It was the voice of a man recalculating. "I know exactly what I'm saying," Clara said. "I also know that 3 men at the sheriff's office don't end this. I know you have connections in this county that go higher than the sheriff. I know you've been manipulating land claims and deed records in this territory for years. And I know that James dying made you think this property was going to fall into your hands the way the others did." She looked at him steadily. "You made a mistake when you sent those men. Because now I know your name in connection with all of it, and so does someone else." Marsh looked at her. He looked around the yard, at the repaired gate, and the stacked wood, and the barn where Elias's horse was stabled alongside hers, and he did the same calculation she'd seen men do her whole life, looking for the piece of the situation they thought they were missing. "Who's been filling your head with this?" he said. "Because someone has, and you should think carefully about the company you're keeping, Clara. A widow alone out here is vulnerable to men who'll tell her what she wants to hear in exchange for—" "Mr. Carter," she said. Elias came out of the cabin. He must have seen Marsh ride in from the window. He came through the door without any hurry and walked to where Clara was standing and stopped just beside and slightly behind her. Not in front of her, not stepping between her and anything, just present, the way a man stood when he was backing someone up rather than taking over from them. He looked at Marsh without any expression at all. Marsh looked at Elias. Clara watched Marsh's face go through 4 distinct calculations in the space of about 2 seconds. He was looking at a man who was bigger than he'd expected, and calmer than suited the situation, and who was looking back at him with the particular quality of attention that experienced men recognized in other men who had been in real trouble and come out the other side. "Mr. Carter," Marsh said finally, with a nod that managed to be both cordial and careful. Elias said nothing. "We were just talking," Marsh said. "I heard," Elias said. The silence ran out to its edges. "You should know," Marsh said, turning back to Clara, and his voice had found a new register now. Not friendly, not quite threatening, something precisely between that would give him room to retreat in either direction. That what those men may have told the sheriff is one version of events. And versions of events have a way of shifting when they're told by men who are trying to avoid consequences. "I have the wire," Clara said. Marsh blinked. "The cut fence wire," she said. "I kept the section from the south fence. 3 clean cuts. I have a statement from Doyle that I wrote down myself, signed by him, that names you specifically as the man who hired him." This was not entirely true. Doyle had not signed anything. But Marsh didn't know that, and the statement she'd written was accurate, and she intended to make it real before this week was out. "And I have a letter going to the federal land office in Helena today, requesting a full review of deed transfers in this county over the last 5 years. Marsh went very still. "Federal," he said. "Federal," she confirmed. It was the word that landed. Not the wire, not Doyle, not Elias standing behind her. The word federal. Because Marsh had built his operation inside the blind spots of county authority. And county authority was the only protection he had, and a federal review was something the county sheriff could not make disappear. "You're making a serious mistake," Marsh said. But his voice had changed again, and this time what it had lost was the certainty. "I don't think so," Clara said. "I think you've been making mistakes in this county for a long time, and I think you made your worst one in August, when your hired men killed my husband." She looked at him with every ounce of the 8 months behind her. The cold mornings and the broken fences and the rifle on the floor beside the bed, and the nights she had lain awake too tired to sleep and too stubborn to quit. "Get off my land, Mr. Marsh." Marsh looked at her. He looked at Elias. He looked at the yard, at the fixed fence, at the stack of firewood that should have been depleted and wasn't. He turned his horse and rode. Clara stood in the yard and watched him go until the road south bent around the rise, and he disappeared. Then she let out a breath that went all the way down to the floor. "The letter to Helena," Elias said from beside her. "That needs to actually happen." "I know," she said. "Today would be better than tomorrow." "I know that too." She turned and looked at him. "Can you help me write it in the right language? I know what I need to say. I don't know all the legal—" "Yes," he said. "Come inside." They spent the better part of that afternoon at the kitchen table, Elias pulling from memory the language of federal land statutes and the specific framing that would flag a review rather than simply a complaint, and Clara writing it out in her firm, clear hand, the hand of a woman who had been educated past what most people in this county expected of a woman, which was something she had been quietly grateful for more than once in the last 8 months. She wrote 2 copies. Elias read them both and made 3 corrections, all of them to technical language rather than to anything she'd said, which she took as a signal that she had said the right things. "Who takes it?" she asked. "I'll ride to Millhaven this afternoon," he said. "Stop at the sheriff's office to check on Doyle and his men, then get this on the post to Helena." He paused. "There's something else you need to know." She looked at him. "The lawyer I mentioned, in Helena." He folded his hands on the table. "His name is Hargreaves. Nathan Hargreaves. He handles federal land cases, has for 20 years. If Marsh has been doing what we think he's been doing, Hargreaves is the man who can unwind it." He paused again. "I need to tell you how I know him." Clara waited. "I did some work for the federal marshal's office after the war," Elias said. He said it carefully, the way he said things that cost him something. "Before I went up the mountain, I was a scout. You knew that. But there was a period before the mountain where I was doing other work. Tracking men. Bringing people in." He looked at the table. "Hargreaves was the lawyer who handled the cases. I brought men to the law, and he made the law do something with them." He paused. "I left that work because of what it was doing to me. But the connection is still there if I use it." Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about the man who had come through her gate 2 days ago, about all the things she had read in him that she hadn't been able to name yet. The competence that wasn't just physical. The way he'd read the canyon terrain and the 3 men's positions. The way he'd secured them without drama. "You tracked men," she said. "Yes." "Outlaws. Some of them outlaws. Some of them just men who'd done wrong and hadn't been made to answer for it yet." He looked up at her. "I'm not going to pretend it was all noble work. Some of it wasn't. But Hargreaves was always straight with me. If I write to him, he'll respond." "Then write to him," Clara said. He looked at her. "Elias," she said, and it was the first time she'd used his given name without the formality of Mr., and they both heard it, and neither of them commented on it. "You've been straight with me since the gate. That's all I need to know." He held her gaze for a moment, something moving in his expression that he contained carefully. Then he nodded once and picked up the pen. He rode to Millhaven that afternoon and came back at dusk with 2 pieces of news. The first was that Doyle and the younger of the 2 men were still in the sheriff's custody, having decided that cooperation suited them better than the alternative. The 3rd man had apparently made a different calculation and was no longer in Millhaven, which was a problem that Elias noted without editorializing. The second piece of news was that the sheriff, a man named Acker, who Clara had found to be carefully neutral on every matter that involved Harlan Marsh, which was itself information, had received their complaint and logged it and said it would be reviewed. "He said reviewed," Clara said. "He said reviewed," Elias confirmed. "Not acted on, not investigated, reviewed." "No." Clara stood at the stove and thought about Sheriff Acker and his careful neutrality, and the relationship between men in small counties and men who ran land offices. And she thought about the letter to Helena and hoped it got there before Marsh could find a way to intercept or discourage it. "The 3rd man," she said. "Gone south from the looks of it," Elias said. "No way to know if he's running from us or running to someone." "Or running to Marsh," Clara said. Elias looked at her across the cabin. "That's what I'd assume," he said. She nodded. She had already assumed it. She had already started thinking about what a man like Marsh would do when his first approach didn't work, and his hired men were in custody, and a woman he'd underestimated was sending letters to federal offices. She had already started thinking about what came next. What came next arrived 3 days later, and it did not come from the direction she expected. It came in the form of a woman. Her name was Margaret Hale, and she arrived at Clara's gate on a Tuesday morning with a buggy and a young man driving it, and a coat that was expensive enough to announce something about her circumstances before she opened her mouth. She was 60, sharp-eyed, white-haired, with the posture of a woman who had spent her life refusing to let the world push her into a smaller shape than she deserved. Clara came out of the house with her hand near the rifle, because that was how she came out to meet strangers now, and she read the woman in the buggy and made several rapid adjustments. "Mrs. Whitmore," the woman said, from the buggy. Not a question. "Yes," Clara said. "My name is Margaret Hale. I own the Hale Ranch, 60 miles northeast of here. I knew your husband." She paused. "I know Harlan Marsh considerably better." Clara lowered her hand from the rifle. Margaret Hale came inside and accepted coffee and declined a chair, preferring to stand near the stove the way people stood when they had things to say that required the option of movement. She looked around the cabin with the same appraiser's attention that Marsh had used, but where his had calculated weakness, hers cataloged something else. The evidence of a woman who had been fighting hard and fighting smart and not giving up. "I heard you sent men to the sheriff," Margaret said, "and a letter to the federal office." "Where did you hear that?" Clara said. "This county is not large," Margaret said. "Information moves." She looked at Clara directly. "Marsh has been working this territory for 15 years. I know of 6 properties he has acquired in that time through methods that would not survive scrutiny. 2 of those properties belong to widows. One of those widows was my cousin." She paused. "I have been gathering documentation for 4 years. I have been waiting for someone with standing in the county to make a formal complaint, because my complaint alone, as a woman from outside the immediate territory, would be too easily dismissed." Clara stood very still. "You need my documentation," Margaret said. "I need your name on the complaint. Together, we have what a federal case requires." Clara thought about James. She thought about August. She thought about Marsh riding into her yard with that paper in his coat and that smile on his face, and the calm, absolute certainty he had operated from for 15 years because nobody had ever been able to put enough pieces together to stop him. "Show me what you have," Clara said. Margaret Hale had a satchel in the buggy that her young driver brought in without being asked, and she spread its contents on Clara's kitchen table. 4 years of records, copies of deed transfers, sworn statements from 2 men who had since left the territory, correspondence that Marsh had never known was being kept, and a surveyor's report that showed 2 boundary adjustments that had quietly consumed portions of neighboring properties in ways the original owners had not been able to fight legally. Clara looked at all of it. She had believed Marsh was doing this. She had felt the shape of it from the moment Doyle said his name. But seeing the actual architecture of it, the years, the careful increments, the way he had worked within the law's language while breaking the law's intent, made something cold and hard settle in her chest. "He's been doing this for 15 years, she said. "At least," Margaret said. "And nobody stopped him. Nobody had enough pieces together at one time." Margaret looked at her steadily. "You have what I didn't. You have fresh testimony from men he employed. You have physical evidence from the fence. And you have the credibility of a woman who fought back publicly and immediately, which makes this current rather than historical." She paused. "I also have something I haven't mentioned yet." Clara looked at her. "I know Nathan Hargreaves," Margaret said. "In Helena. I've been corresponding with him for a year." Clara blinked. Elias, who had been sitting at the far end of the table with his coffee and saying nothing, set his cup down. Margaret Hale looked at him for the first time with full attention. "You're Carter," she said. It wasn't a question either. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Nathan mentioned you might be involved. He wrote to me 2 days ago." A brief, dry something crossed her face that might have been satisfaction. "Small world, Mr. Carter." "Smaller than I expected," he said. Clara looked between them. "You two know each other?" We know people in common, Margaret said, which is how things work when you've been alive long enough. She turned back to Clara. Nathan Hargreaves is prepared to take this case, federally, formal deposition. Your account, James's death, the August incident, Marsh's approach afterward, all of it in your own words with your signature on it. I can do that, Clara said immediately. It will require you to ride to Helena. I know where Helena is. It will take you away from this ranch for at least a week. Clara looked at Elias. He looked back at her without expression, waiting. The ranch will be managed, Clara said. Margaret looked at Elias. Elias looked at the table. The geometry of that exchange was not lost on Margaret Hale, who had been reading rooms and the people in them for 6 decades, and who said nothing about it, but whose expression shifted slightly in a direction that was not entirely neutral. I'll need 2 days to organize the records for the deposition, Margaret said. Can I leave these with you? Yes, Clara said. I'll keep them locked in the strongbox. Margaret nodded. She looked at Clara with the direct, steady gaze of a woman who did not offer things she didn't mean. You know he'll find out you've left, she said. Marsh, the moment you're not on this property, he'll hear about it. I know, Clara said. He may try to move while you're gone. Push something through the county clerk. File something against the deed. He can file what he wants, Clara said. The property isn't going anywhere, and when I come back from Helena, I'll have a federal case behind me. Margaret looked at her for a moment, and the something that crossed her face this time was warmer. Your husband spoke well of you, she said quietly. At the Mercantile in Millhaven, 2 years before he died. I met him once. He said, and I remember this clearly because it struck me at the time, he said, my Clara could run this whole territory if anyone would let her. She paused. I think he was right. Clara looked at the table. The silence lasted exactly as long as she needed it to. Thank you for coming, Mrs. Hale, she said, her voice steady. Margaret gathered herself to leave. At the door, she stopped and looked back. Her eyes went to Elias, who had stood when she stood, because that was how he was, and she looked at him with a directness that made him meet her gaze. Take care of this property while she's gone, Mr. Carter, she said, and take care of her on the road. Yes, ma'am, he said. Margaret Hale went out, and her young driver helped her up to the buggy, and they rolled back down the road south, and Clara stood at the cabin door and watched her go. She turned back into the room. Elias was still standing where he had been, and he was looking at her with that quiet, particular attention, and she could see from the set of his jaw that he was thinking about the road to Helena and what it meant for him to go with her, and what it meant about what they were becoming. She looked at him. He looked at her. Helena, she said. Helena, he agreed. It's 4 days' ride. 3, if we push. I'm not leaving until the property is secured, she said. The east fence needs the second wire run, and the barn latch is still loose, and I want someone from town to know where I've gone and when I'm expected back. 3 days of preparation, he said. 2, she said. I don't want to give Marsh more time than necessary to figure out what I'm doing. He almost smiled. 2 days, then. She nodded. She started to turn back toward the table, and the documents spread across it, and then she stopped. Elias, she said. Yes, what he said. Marsh, when he came. About men filling my head with things. She looked at him steadily. I want to be clear about something. What I know and what I'm doing. The letter to Helena, the documentation, deciding to go for the deposition. That is mine. I decided it. You helped me see the path, and I'm grateful for that. But the decision is mine. He looked at her with those calm, serious eyes. I know that, he said. I've never thought otherwise. Good, she said. I wanted to say it out loud. I'm glad you did, he said. They worked through the rest of that day and the next preparing. Clara organizing the legal documents and writing the account of August in her own hand. Every detail she had been carrying alone for 8 months, finally committed to paper in the terms a federal case required. She wrote it without stopping except once, when she got to the part about finding James at the gate in the early light, and she stopped and sat at the table with the pen in her hand and breathed through it. And Elias, who was working at the other end of the table on something else, said nothing, and did not move toward her, and did not try to fix it, which was the right thing, the only right thing. And after a minute, she picked up the pen and kept writing. On the second morning, while Elias was saddling the horses, a rider came fast from the direction of Millhaven. Clara saw him from the porch and read the speed of him as urgency, and she had the rifle in her hands by the time he reached the gate, but she recognized him before he pulled up. It was Tom Greer, who ran the feed store in Millhaven, and who had been decent to her in the months since James died, in the way some people were decent, quietly, and without making a show of it. "Mrs. Whitmore," Greer said, pulling his horse up hard. He was breathing like he'd ridden fast, and he looked like a man carrying bad news at full speed. "Doyle's gone." Clara's hands tightened on the rifle. "The sheriff let him out this morning," Greer said. "Don't know exactly why. Said the evidence wasn't enough to hold him longer without a formal charge from the county attorney. And the county attorney works with Marsh," Clara said flatly. Greer's expression told her she was right. "There's more. The third man, the one who left Millhaven, he came back last night. Came back with 4 others. They were seen at Marsh's property this morning." Elias had come around the side of the barn when he heard Greer arrive. He was standing at the edge of the yard, listening. "7 men," he said, not loudly. "That we know of," Greer said. He looked at Clara with an expression that was trying very hard to be steady and not quite making it. "Ma'am, I don't know what you've stirred up, but Marsh isn't a man who absorbs losses quietly. He's done it before. When someone pushed back too hard, he stopped himself. There was a family, 3 years back. The Hendersons. They had documentation too, or they said they did. They left the territory." He paused. "Left fast and didn't come back." "The Hendersons left," Clara said. "Yes, ma'am." "I'm not the Hendersons," she said. Greer looked at her for a moment. He looked at Elias. He looked back at Clara. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "I don't reckon you are." "Thank you for riding out, Tom," she said. "I mean it." He nodded and turned his horse and rode back toward town, and Clara stood on the porch in the morning cold with the rifle in her hands and listened to the hoofbeats fade and thought about 7 men at Marsh's property and Doyle walking free and the county attorney making the law perform the particular trick of protecting the wrong people. Elias came to stand beside her. "We need to move the departure up," he said. "Tonight," she said. "Before dark would be better." She looked at him. 7 men was a number she could feel the weight of. Not with fear, she had moved past fear into something that was harder and cleaner, but with the pragmatic clarity of someone calculating odds. The documents were in the strong box. The deposition was written. The horses were already being saddled. "If we leave now," she said, "and Marsh finds out." "He'll know you went to Helena," Elias said. "He already suspects it. But getting ahead of him by 12 hours matters. And the ranch?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the property, the barn, the fences they'd fixed, the cattle in the south pasture, the cabin that had been Clara's whole world for 8 months. "You trust Tom Greer?" he said. "More than most. Ride back to town and ask him to keep an eye. He already knows enough to know why." He paused. "We can't be in 2 places. And Helena is where this gets decided." Clara looked at the cabin door. She thought about the rifle by the bed, and the months of cold, and the morning. She had pressed her hand against the stove, and told herself she was not tired when she was absolutely exhausted. She thought about James in the good coat in the photograph on the shelf, and what he would say about her riding for Helena with a former federal scout and a satchel full of evidence to take Harlan Marsh apart in front of a federal lawyer. She thought he would say go. She thought he would say go fast. "Saddle my horse properly," she said to Elias. "I'll get the documents." She went inside and took the strong box from under the floorboard beneath the bed, and opened it and took it out the documents. All of them. Margaret Hale's 4 years of evidence, and her own deposition, and the sworn statement from Doyle that she had written and had not yet been able to get signed and was going to take anyway. She wrapped them in oilcloth and put them in the saddlebag she had prepared 2 days ago for this ride. She took the photograph of James off the shelf and looked at it for a moment and put it in the bag too, because she was not sentimental in the way people thought women were sentimental, but she was going to do this thing for him, and she wanted him along. She took the rifle and its ammunition. She took the strongbox money. Not much, but enough for the road and a few days in Helena. She stood in the middle of the cabin and looked at everything she was leaving. Then she walked out and pulled the door shut behind her. Elias had both horses ready. He was checking the cinch on his saddle, and he looked up when she came out, and he read her face the way he read most things, completely and without comment. He just held her horse and waited. Clara mounted. She looked back once at the cabin. "If he burns it," she said, and her voice did not shake, "I'll build it back." "We'll build it back," Elias said, and the words sat there between them. Not a slip, not a casual correction, a deliberate thing. Clara looked at him. He met her eyes and held them. "Let's ride," she said. They rode out of the yard at a pace that said they were not running, but they were also not wasting time, and the Montana Territory opened up ahead of them, wide and cold and indifferent and enormous. And somewhere behind them, Harlan Marsh was receiving news from a writer about documents and federal letters, and a widow who had turned out to be a great deal more than he had calculated for. And somewhere ahead, in Helena, a lawyer named Nathan Hargreaves was expecting them. Clara rode with the saddlebag against her leg and the rifle across her saddle, and 8 months of grief and rage and stubborn, exhausting love for a piece of land, and the man she'd shared it with distilled into the clean purpose of a woman who knew exactly where she was going and why. Beside her, Elias Carter rode with the particular quality of presence she had come to recognize as his version of commitment. Not loud, not declarative, just completely, steadily there. The road north toward Helena was long, and the weather was cold, and what waited at the end of it was uncertain. But they rode toward it together, and that, for now, was enough. They rode through the first night and into the gray morning without stopping, except to water the horses at a creek crossing, where the ice had broken enough along the edges to reach the current beneath. Clara dismounted and held her horse's reins and watched the animal drink and thought about the ranch behind her. Whether Tom Greer had ridden out to keep watch, whether the cattle were still in the south pasture, whether the cabin was standing. She had not let herself think about it on the road, because thinking about it served nothing. But in the stillness of the creek crossing with the cold coming up off the water, it moved through her the way worry did when you stopped moving long enough to feel it. "Stop," Elias said from beside her. She looked at him. "Whatever you're thinking about back there," he said. "Stop. You can't fix it from here." "I know that," she said. "You're thinking about it anyway." She looked at the water. "You can't tell me what to think about." "No," he agreed. "I'm asking you not to, because we've got 2 days of hard road ahead, and I need your head where we are, not where we were." She looked at him. He was right, which was irritating. And he knew he was right, which was more irritating. And the fact that he had said it the way he said everything, plainly, without any softening that would have made it easier to reject, meant she couldn't dismiss it. "Fine," she said. "Thank you," he said. They remounted and rode north. The road to Helena, in early spring, was not the road people took in the warm months. It was narrower, less traveled, with sections that had turned to mud and refrozen and turned to a rutted surface that was hard on the horses and required attention. Elias rode slightly ahead, where the road was uncertain, and slightly beside her, where it was clear. And Clara noticed the pattern without commenting on it, because she understood what it meant without needing it explained. How was reading the road for her? Not because she couldn't read it herself, because 2 sets of eyes were better than one, and because somewhere behind them there were 7 men at Marsh's property who knew they had ridden north. On the second night, they stopped at a small way station. Barely a station, really. Just a man named Hicks, who rented 2 rooms and a barn stall to travelers, and charged more than the accommodation warranted, and didn't ask questions, which was worth the price. Clara took the smaller room, and Elias took the other, and she lay on the narrow bed in her clothes, with the saddlebag under her head, and listened to the sounds of the building settling in the cold and thought about Nathan Hargreaves and what a federal case actually looked like when it was moving. She thought about James's face in the photograph inside the bag. She thought about August. The way mornings looked different now than they had before August. The particular quality of early light in late summer that she had loved her whole life and now could not see without the other thing layered beneath it. She thought about Doyle's voice saying it got out of hand, and she thought about the specific kind of damage done by men who killed other people's husbands and considered it getting out of hand, a thing that happened rather than a thing they did. She thought about what winning in Helena would actually mean, not just for the land, not just for the deed, but for August. Whether a federal land case brought against Marsh would touch what happened to James at all, whether there was a distinction in the law between what Marsh had done to the land and what Marsh had done to her husband, whether justice for one was the same as justice for the other, or whether they lived in separate legal territories that never quite overlapped. She was still thinking about it when she heard a sound that was wrong. Not the building settling, not the wind. Something deliberate. A footstep, heavy and trying not to be, in the passage outside her door. Clara had the rifle in her hands before she was fully upright. She had been sleeping with it since August. The motion was automatic. She stood beside the bed and faced the door and did not make a sound. The footsteps stopped outside. 3 seconds of silence. Then a knock. 2 sharp raps, low on the door, and Elias's voice. "It's me. Don't shoot." She let out a breath that came from somewhere in her chest cavity. "I wasn't going to shoot," she said, which was not entirely true. "I know," he said, which suggested he also knew it wasn't entirely true. "Get your things. We need to ride." She had her saddlebag over her shoulder before he finished the sentence. She opened the door. Howe was fully dressed, fully equipped, the particular readiness of a man who had not actually slept. "There's a rider," he said, keeping his voice low. "Came in from the south 20 minutes ago. Talked to Hicks. Hicks told him 2 travelers had stopped. Didn't give names, but described us well enough." He paused. "The rider left south again. He's not alone." "Marsh sent someone after us," Clara said. "He sent someone to track us. Whether he sent enough people to do anything about it is the question." He looked at her steadily. "If we ride now, we gain 4 hours on whoever is coming. Helena is a full day out. We can make it ahead of them if we push. And if we can't, then we deal with that when we get to it," he said, and his voice had the same quality it had in the canyon. Not casual, just certain. Like a man who had been in bad situations enough to know that catastrophizing them before they arrived was only useful if it changed your current action, and currently, the action was riding. They saddled the horses in the dark barn, with the minimum of lantern light. Hicks watching from the doorway with the expression of a man who had learned that what travelers did at 2 in the morning was not his business. Clara pressed coins into his hand that were more than they owed, not because she was buying his silence. She couldn't buy his silence if someone came asking with authority, but because it was right to pay what was owed. They rode out into the cold dark and pushed north harder than she had ridden since August. Clara did not think about the ranch. She thought about the road ahead, and the horse under her, and the saddlebag against her leg, and staying in the saddle, because that was what the situation required, and she had learned to give situations what they required. They rode for 6 hours without stopping. When dawn came, Elias eased the pace, and they let the horses breathe, and Clara looked back down the road they had come and saw nothing, which could have meant they were far enough ahead, or could have meant nothing at all, since the road had enough bends in it to hide what was behind. "How far?" she said. 8 hours, Elias said. "Maybe 7 if the road stays hard." "It'll stay hard," she said. "Temperature's not going up." "Then 7, he said. "We'll be there before dark." They stopped once more to water the horses and eat something cold from the saddlebag, dried meat and biscuits that had gone hard overnight, but were food, which was sufficient. Clara ate standing up because sitting down felt like conceding something to the road she wasn't prepared to concede. Elias watched her eat with a look she had started to recognize, the look he had when he was deciding whether to say something. She had learned to let him arrive at the decision on his own, because pushing at it made him quieter, not more forthcoming. "Tell me about Hargreaves," she said, to give him something specific. He chewed, swallowed, looked at the road. 60 years old, give or take. Started in federal law after the war. Worked his way up through land cases specifically because after the war, There was more land fraud in the territories than you could count, and most of it never got prosecuted because the federal presence was thin and the local law was bought. He paused. He's not a man who loses cases he decides to take. He's also not a man who decides to take cases he doesn't think he can win. Then we'd better have enough for him to work with, Clara said. You've got Doyle's testimony, the physical evidence, Margaret Hale's 4 years of documentation, and your own deposition covering August, Elias said. If that's not enough to get him to take it, we'll know in the first 10 minutes of the meeting and we'll find another way. What other way? She said. He looked at her. Let's see what he says first. She looked at him for a moment. You always do that, she said. Do what? Answer the question one step at a time. Don't answer what comes after until you've answered what's in front. It's more efficient, he said. It's also a way of not having to admit you don't know what comes after, she said. He was quiet for a beat. Then, sometimes, he said. Yes. She almost smiled. She turned back to the road and kept her face level, but she felt him see it anyway. They reached Helena in the last gray light of the afternoon, the horses tired but sound, and Clara felt the city around her the way she always felt cities. Too loud, too close, too many people moving in too many directions, without any of the legible logic of open land. She had grown up in a city, before James and Montana, but 8 months of near-total solitude had reset her tolerances. Elias navigated without hesitation toward a boarding house on the south end of the main street. He had been here before, she could see that from the way he moved through the streets, and arranged 2 rooms with the efficiency of a man who had been arranging lodging in unfamiliar places his whole adult life. Clara did not argue about the cost. She did not argue about anything except taking the room on the ground floor, which she wanted because ground floor meant one exit. She could hear from her bed, and a window she could clear in under a minute if she had to. Elias looked at her when she specified the ground floor. Habit, she said, before he could ask. Yes, he said. Mine too. She thought about that. About 2 people who had both learned to sleep with their exits planned, who both woke to wrong sounds, who both moved through the world with one part of their attention always monitoring. She thought about what it meant that this had become comfort rather than unease, being with someone who understood the habit because they had the same one. She did not say any of this. She took her key and her saddlebag and went to her room and washed 8 months of Montana winter off her face and changed into the one clean dress she had brought and sat on the edge of the bed and put her hands flat on her knees and breathed. She was here. She had the documents. Tomorrow morning she would sit across a desk from Nathan Hargreaves and say what she needed to say and find out whether the law was going to be something that worked for her or something she would have to work around. She thought about James. She said quietly to the empty room, "I'm here, James. I made it this far." Then she stood up and went to dinner. Hargreaves's office was on the 2nd floor of a brick building 2 streets from the territorial courthouse, and it looked exactly like what it was. The office of a man who had spent 30 years accumulating paper evidence of other people's wrongdoing and had run out of shelf space some years back. Every surface held something. Bound records, correspondence, surveyor's maps pinned 3 deep to the wall, stacks of documents with handwritten labels on strips of paper tucked into their edges. Hargreaves himself was smaller than Clara had expected. Compact, gray-bearded, with reading glasses he kept taking off and putting back on, and the hands of a man who wrote for a living, ink-stained at the right-hand fingertips. He stood when they came in and shook Clara's hand with a firm directness that she appreciated. And then he looked at Elias, and the 2 men did the particular thing that men who had worked together in difficult circumstances did. Not quite a handshake, not quite a nod, something between that communicated a great deal in a very small space. "Carter," Hargreaves said. "Nathan," Elias said. "You look like the mountains agree with you." "They do," Elias said. "Mostly." Hargreaves looked at him for 1 second longer than the words warranted, reading something in the mostly that Clara suspected was connected to why Elias was sitting in a Helena lawyer's office instead of at a trapping camp in the high country, and then he turned back to Clara with full attention. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "sit down and tell me everything." She told him everything. She told it in order, without decoration, the way she had written the deposition. August 1st, James at the gate, the months after. Marsh's visits, the cut fence wire, the canyon. Doyle's testimony. Margaret Hale's arrival with 4 years of documentation. And the rider at the way station 2 nights ago, who told them clearly that Marsh knew where they were going. Hargreaves listened without interrupting. He took no notes, which surprised her until she understood that he was the kind of man who listened first and organized later, that the notes would come after he had the whole shape of it. His expression did not change in ways she could read, which was its own kind of information. This was not a man who let situations move his face before he had decided what to do with them. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The documentation from Mrs. Hale. May I see it?" Clara opened the saddlebag and laid Margaret Hale's 4 years of work on the desk between them, and Hargreaves put his glasses on and went through it with the focused speed of a man reading for information rather than meaning, picking up pages and setting them down and picking up others and occasionally making a sound that was not quite a word. He went through it all. Then he took his glasses off and set them on the desk and looked at Clara. "This is enough," he said. Clara's chest tightened hard. "Not just for a federal review," he said. "For a prosecution. Marsh has been operating a systematic land fraud scheme across 6 counties for 15 years, and Mrs. Hale has documented 5 of those years with a precision that most federal prosecutors would weep to have." He paused. "Combined with your direct testimony and the physical evidence from the fence, and assuming Doyle's testimony holds when taken formally, we have the foundation of a federal criminal case." He paused again. "Not just a land case." Clara looked at him. "Criminal," she said. "Criminal," he confirmed. "Land fraud at this scale, with this level of documentation, crosses into federal criminal jurisdiction, which means it goes above county authority entirely." He held her gaze. "Which also means that whatever Marsh has at the county level, the sheriff, the county attorney, whoever else he's kept on his side, none of it matters once the federal process begins." Clara sat with this. She had come here hoping for legal protection for her deed. She had not let herself think much further than that, because hoping too far ahead was something she had learned to be careful about. But Hargreaves was sitting across from her telling her that what she had in the saddlebag was enough to bring Harlan Marsh down entirely. Not just stop him from taking her land, but prosecute him for what he had done across 15 years in 6 counties, to every person who had been in the path of his careful, incremental theft, for what he had done to James. She breathed through it. "August," she said, when she could speak evenly. "My husband, what happens with August?" Hargreaves's expression shifted, still controlled, but something in it became careful in a way that told her he had been waiting for this question. "The criminal land fraud prosecution and a murder investigation are technically separate," he said. "I won't mislead you about that. The federal case I can take. A murder investigation requires the territorial sheriff's involvement, and in this case, that becomes complicated by jurisdiction." He paused. "However," he picked up one of Margaret Hale's documents. 2 of the properties she documented involved incidents that were ruled accidents at the time. The Henderson family left the territory following what was described as harassment and an unspecified incident that was never formally investigated. He looked at Clara. "A federal criminal investigation has subpoena authority. Once Marsh is under federal investigation, everything gets looked at, including August." Clara looked at her hands on the desk. "Everything," she said. "Everything," he confirmed. Elias, who had been sitting to her left and saying nothing, said quietly, "Will you take it?" Hargreaves looked at him. "I'll take it," he said. "I've been waiting for a case like this since Margaret Hale first wrote to me. She didn't have standing. Mrs. Whitmore does." He looked back at Clara. "I need 2 things from you. A formal deposition taken here, on record, today if possible. And your patience. This will move faster than county law, but slower than you want it to." "How long?" Clara said. "To get the federal process initiated. 2 weeks, maybe 3. To get Marsh in front of a federal judge. That depends on how much he fights it, and men like Marsh fight everything." He paused. 6 months, maybe. Possibly a year. A year. Clara thought about a year. She thought about going back to the ranch and holding it for another year while Harlan Marsh figured out what was happening and tried to find a way to stop it. She thought about 7 men at his property, and Doyle walking free, and the third man who had ridden south from Millhaven and come back with 4 more. While the process is moving, she said, I'm still on that property, and Marsh will know within a week that I was here. Yes, Hargreaves said. He didn't soften it. Can you do anything about that? About protection? I can file a federal injunction against any interference with your property within 48 hours of the deposition, he said. It doesn't put a man with a gun on your land, but it puts a federal document behind you that makes anything Marsh does to that property while the case is active a direct contempt of federal authority, which is significantly more serious than a local complaint. He looked at her steadily. It won't stop a man who's desperate enough, but it changes his calculation. Clara nodded. Take the deposition today, she said. File the injunction as fast as you can. She paused. And send a copy to every federal office in the territory, so there are too many of them for him to quietly make disappear. Hargreaves looked at her for a moment, and something moved through his expression that she thought might have been respect, the kind that had to be earned before it showed up. That, he said, is exactly the right instinct. The deposition took 3 hours. Clara sat across from Hargreaves and a deputy recorder and said everything she had already said and more. The details she had not put in the written account because she had not known what was legally relevant. The things she remembered from August that she had not let herself say out loud since August. The texture of the months after, in a way that was harder than the facts, because the facts she had organized and armored. But the texture was still raw in places she hadn't finished dealing with. Elias waited outside. When it was done, she came out into the corridor and stood for a moment with her hand on the wall, because she was steadier than she expected to be, and she wanted to check that before she moved. Elias looked at her from where he was standing. He didn't move toward her. He didn't ask. It's done, she said. Yes, he said. All of it. Everything from August. She looked at the floor. I said it all out loud, on record, with someone writing it down. She paused. It was harder than I thought it would be. I know, he said. But it's done now. It is, he said. It doesn't go away. But now it's somewhere other than just inside you. She looked at him. She had not thought of it exactly that way. As the weight of it redistributed rather than lifted, as the record existing somewhere outside her own memory, so that she did not have to be the only one holding it. She thought about that. She thought about August living in a federal deposition in a lawyer's office in Helena, rather than solely in the place behind her ribs where she had been keeping it for 8 months. Yes, she said. That's exactly what it is. They ate dinner in a small place on the main street where the food was better than traveling food. And Clara drank 2 cups of coffee because the afternoon had taken something from her that caffeine was not going to replace, but was a reasonable start. Elias ate steadily and without comment and watched the room with the peripheral attention she recognized as habitual rather than reactive, and she found herself watching him watch the room and thinking about the life he had built on the mountain and what it looked like from the inside. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes, he said. The mountain, she said. The 10 years. What was it actually like? Not the practical parts. I understand the practical parts. What was it like to be there? He looked at her. He picked up his coffee and held it without drinking it. Quiet, he said finally. That's a practical part, she said. He almost smiled. Fair. He thought about it. Safe, he said. I always knew what was coming because the mountain told you. Weather, game, season, everything announced itself. Nothing happened without some kind of warning if you knew how to read it. He paused. People don't announce themselves the same way. People surprise you. And the surprises I had before the mountain were the kind that... He stopped. The kind that broke things, she said. Yes, he said. So you went somewhere things didn't break the same way. Things broke, he said. Equipment, traps, a horse one winter. But it was breakage I could fix or understood the reason for. He looked at the table. What happened during the war was breakage I couldn't fix and couldn't understand the reason for. My wife died while I was away doing things I was told were necessary, and by the time I came back she was already buried, and the house was sold by her family, and there was nothing left to fix and nowhere to go back to." He said it all in the same careful, even register he used for things that had been looked at so many times they had worn smooth. The mountain didn't ask me to explain any of that, so I stayed. Clara listened to all of it. She did not offer anything back immediately because she could hear that he wasn't finished, not with the words, but with the act of saying them. The act of saying them out loud to another person rather than to the empty camp on the mountain. "Her name was Alice," he said. "She was 26. She died of fever in the winter of '64 while I was in Tennessee." He looked up at Clara. "I've said her name maybe 4 times in 10 years. Alice," Clara said quietly, saying it because it deserved to be said, because a woman who had died at 26 while her husband was in Tennessee deserved to have her name in the air occasionally. Elias looked at her. "James," she said. "Alice. 2 people who died too young and left 2 people at this table with more weight than either of them should be carrying alone." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I'm not trying to make it into something tidy," she said. "There's nothing tidy about it. I'm just—" She stopped herself. She looked at the table. "I'm saying that I understand the weight, and I'm glad you told me about her." Elias was quiet for a long time. The restaurant moved around them. Other people, other conversations, the ordinary motion of a city evening. "I'm glad I told you too," he said. They sat with it. It was Clara who eventually said, "We need to be back on the road tomorrow. If Marsh's man has reported back, Marsh knows we were in Helena. The injunction will take 2 days to file. We should be home when it arrives." "Agreed," Elias said. "Can Hargreaves handle what comes next without us here?" "Yes. He doesn't need us to build the case. He needs us to stay on the property and not give Marsh anything that looks like abandonment or default." He paused. "You being at the ranch is the single most important thing right now. A woman who walked away from a federal case would be a gift to Marsh's lawyers. A woman who went to Helena, gave her deposition, and rode home to work her land is not." "Then we ride home tomorrow," she said. He nodded. He started to say something, stopped, started again. "Clara." She looked at him. "When we get back," he said carefully, finding the words one at a time, "and things are in motion with Hargreaves, and the injunction is filed, I want to have a conversation with you about what comes next." He held her gaze. "Not about Marsh, about—" He stopped. "About what you're doing," she said. "About what we are," he said. And the word landed with the particular weight of something that had been building for days and was now no longer containable. Clara looked at him across the table. She looked at the man who had held her horse's leg in the snow and cut 2 hours of firewood without asking, and ridden into a canyon with her, and sat through her deposition and told her about Alice. "Yes," she said, "we should have that conversation. When things are more—" "No," she said. "Not when things are more settled. Things are never more settled. We have it when we're ready to have it." She paused. "I'll tell you when I'm ready." "All right," he said. "It may be soon," she said, and she looked at the table when she said it, but she felt him go still across from her in the way people went still when something they had been hoping for became more real than hope. They rode back the next morning in the early dark, and they pushed hard because the road home felt different from the road here. The road here had been an act of determination, and the road home was an act of reclamation. Clara rode with the empty saddlebag against her leg, the documents left behind with Hargreaves, and felt the difference. The weight gone from the bag, but not from her, redistributed into something that was moving now, set in motion, aimed at the right target. 12 hours into the ride, with the ranch 2 hours ahead, Elias raised his hand. She stopped. He was looking at the road ahead, at a point she couldn't read yet, with that specific stillness that meant he had registered something before she had. "What?" she said. "Smoke," he said. She looked ahead, and she smelled it. Her heart stopped for 1 full second. "Where?" she said, and her voice came out very level because she would not let it do otherwise. "South," he said, Not from the road. He looked at her. Not the cabin. She breathed. But close, he said. She kicked her horse into a run. They came around the last bend with both horses at full gallop, and the ranch came into sight, and the cabin was standing intact, the smoke coming from the stovepipe in the ordinary way of a fire built inside. And Clara felt the relief hit her so hard she had to grip the saddle horn for a second to stay in it. Tom Greer was on the porch. He stood up when he saw them coming, and his face did something complicated that she recognized as a man who had been keeping watch and was very glad to be relieved of it. "You're back," he said. "We're back," she said, pulling her horse up. "What's the smoke south?" "Marsh's man came out 2 days ago," Greer said. He looked between her and Elias with an expression that was trying to be steady. "3 of them. Rode the fence line, looked at the property. Didn't come in, just looked." He paused. "Then they rode to the Henderson place, south 3 miles. Henderson's been empty 3 years. They camped there." He paused again. "They're still there." Clara looked at Elias. Elias looked south. "They're waiting," he said. "For what?" Greer said. Elias looked at Clara. She looked back at him. They both knew the answer. They were waiting to see if she came back. Clara looked at the cabin. She looked at the land around it, at the cattle in the south pasture, at the fence lines they had repaired together. She looked at everything she had fought 8 months to hold, and was going to keep fighting to hold for however long it took. She dismounted. She handed her reins to Greer. She walked up the porch steps and pulled the cabin door open and stood in the doorway of her own home. "They can wait," she said. "I'm home." She went inside, and Elias Carter stood in the yard with the cold wind on his face and looked at the door she'd walked through and thought about the mountain and the empty camp and the 10 years of careful solitude he had built as armor against exactly the kind of feeling that was in his chest right now. He thought about all of it. Then he tied his horse at the post and followed her inside. The 3 men at the Henderson place were still there the next morning. Clara knew because Elias had ridden the south fence line at first light and come back with that particular quality of stillness he carried when he had information he was organizing before he delivered it. She read it in the way he came through the door and poured coffee before he spoke, the way he set the cup down and looked at her with those steady, serious eyes. 3 horses, he said. "Same as yesterday. They haven't moved camp." "They're not going to move," Clara said. "Not until Marsh tells them to." "Or until the injunction arrives," Elias said. "Which Hargreaves said 2 days," she said. "So today or tomorrow?" "Today or tomorrow," he agreed. She looked at the table. She looked at the 2 cups of coffee between them, and the morning coming through the window, and the ordinary domestic fact of another person in her kitchen, and she thought about how quickly something could go from unfamiliar to necessary without you noticing the shift happening. "Tom should go home," she said. "He's done enough." "He won't go easy," Elias said. "He's got it in his head that this is his post now." "I'll tell him firmly," Clara said. "He'll argue with you." "Most people argue with me," she said. "I usually win." Elias almost smiled into his coffee. "Yes," he said. "You do." She sent Tom Greer home after breakfast with her genuine thanks and the understanding that she would send word if anything changed, and Greer went, though not without pointing out twice that he was only a 2-hour ride south and could be back before lunch if needed. Clara thanked him both times. He rode south, and she watched him go, and then she turned back to the work because the ranch did not suspend itself for legal proceedings. The morning passed in the particular rhythm they had built together over the past week, a rhythm that Clara had stopped pretending she didn't rely on. Elias fixed the last section of east fence that had been on the list since before he arrived. Clara cleaned and oiled the rifle and the spare revolver she had kept in the strongbox since James died and had not fired since the canyon. She loaded both weapons with the methodical attention of someone who expected to need them and was not going to be caught unprepared. Around midday, one of the 3 men from the Henderson camp rode slowly up the road toward the gate. Clara was on the porch when she saw him coming. She did not go inside for the rifle because it was already in her hands. Elias came around the corner of the barn and stopped at the fence post and watched. The man stopped his horse at the gate. He was young, younger than she expected, with a face that had been trying to grow a beard for some time without notable success. He looked at Clara on the porch with the Winchester. He looked at Elias at the fence post. He looked like a man who had been sent to deliver a message and was reconsidering the job. "I've got a letter," he said from the gate. "From Mr. Marsh." "Leave it on the post," Clara said. He leaned over and tucked the envelope under the top rail of the gate post and then pulled his horse back 3 steps, which she appreciated as evidence of basic intelligence. She came down from the porch and crossed the yard and took the letter without taking her eyes off him for more than the second it required to pick it up. "Tell me," she said, "are you a man who makes his own choices? Or are you a man who does what Marsh pays him to do regardless?" The young man blinked. "I ask," she said, "because in about 24 hours there is going to be a federal injunction attached to this property, and anyone who interferes with it will be in contempt of federal authority. Not county authority. Federal." She looked at him steadily. "Marsh's money doesn't reach that far. Yours is a decision worth making carefully." The young man looked at her. He looked at Elias. He looked at the letter she was holding. "I'll pass that along," he said, which was not exactly what she had asked, but his voice had lost the practiced indifference it had arrived with. "You do that," she said. He rode back south. Elias came to stand beside her while she opened the letter. She read it standing in the yard, and she read it twice because the first time she needed to take in the content, and the second time she needed to think about what the content meant. She handed it to Elias without comment. He read it. His jaw tightened once, which for him was the equivalent of a stronger reaction in another man. The letter was from Marsh's lawyer, not Marsh himself, which was its own kind of information. And it stated in careful legal language that a review of the original deed transfer for the Whitmore property had revealed a procedural irregularity in the recording of James Whitmore's original claim, and that pending clarification of this irregularity, the status of the deed was uncertain, and that Marsh's office was prepared to assist in resolving the situation by taking the property into administrative holding while the matter was reviewed. Administrative holding. Clara had not heard the specific phrase before, but she understood it immediately as the legal equivalent of a hand closing around something while the paperwork caught up to the theft. "He found a lever in the deed," she said. "Or he manufactured one," Elias said. "Can he do that? Manufacture an irregularity in a recorded deed?" "He runs the land office," Elias said. "He has access to the original filing records. If he changed something in the recording—" He stopped. He looked at the letter again. "This is why he's been watching rather than acting. He's been working on the legal side while his men were visible on the road, giving us something to watch while he did the actual work somewhere else." Clara felt the cold move through her that had nothing to do with temperature. She had been focused on the men at the Henderson place. She had been watching the road. And Marsh had been in the land office with the original filing records and a pen. "Hargreaves," she said. "Yes," Elias said. "We need to get this letter to Hargreaves today." "I can't leave the property," she said. "If I leave now, while he's claiming irregularity in the deed, it looks like—" "I'll go," Elias said. She looked at him. "I can ride to Millhaven and wire Helena faster than a letter will get there," he said. "Hargreaves needs to see this language before he files the injunction so he can address it directly. 2 hours there, 2 back." He held her gaze. "You stay on the property. You don't let anyone through that gate. The rifle stays in your hands." "I know how to hold a rifle," she said. "I know you do," he said. He took the letter back from her and folded it and put it in his coat. He looked at her with that look he had, the one that was not quite an expression because he kept it controlled, but that she had learned to read for what it actually was. 2 hours, he said. "Go," she said. He went. She went back to the porch with the Winchester, and the morning stretched into afternoon, and she watched the road south and the road north, and the fence lines she could see from the porch, and she thought about James's original claim filing, and whether Marsh had changed something in it, and how long he had been planning this particular move. She thought about the fact that she had been on this land for 4 years with James, and 8 months without him, and that every inch of it was paid for in the kind of currency that didn't show up in deed records. The work of it, the seasons of it, the grief of it, the getting up in the cold and doing it again. She thought about the fact that a man who had never spent a night on this land was sitting in an office in Millhaven trying to take it from her with a pen. She held the rifle, and she waited. Elias came back in under 2 hours, which meant he had ridden hard both ways. He came through the gate at a pace that told her the news was significant before he opened his mouth. "Hargreaves wired back inside 30 minutes, he said, pulling his horse up and coming off it almost in the same motion. He knows the procedural irregularity move. Says Marsh has used a version of it twice before, both times against properties where the original claimant was deceased, and the surviving party didn't have legal counsel." He looked at her. "He says to tell you exactly this. James Whitmore's original claim was witnessed by a federal land agent, not a county agent. That means the recording is in the federal system, not just the county system. Marsh can alter the county copy. He cannot alter the federal record." Clara stood very still. "The federal record," she said. "The original filing went to the federal land office because James was claiming under the Homestead Act," Elias said. "Marsh apparently didn't know that, or didn't check carefully enough, because he's used to working in county records where he has access. The federal copy exists in Helena. Hargreaves already has someone pulling it." He paused. "Whatever Marsh changed in the county filing, the federal record is going to show what the original said." Clara sat down on the porch step. She sat down because her legs decided the situation warranted it, which was not something she was accustomed to, and she recognized it as the particular physical reaction of a woman who had been holding herself at a level of controlled tension for days and had just had a significant portion of that tension cut. The federal record. James had filed under the Homestead Act. She had known that. She had been at the filing. She remembered the federal land agent, a young man from back east, who had shaken James's hand and told him the claim was solid. She had not thought about that in months, because she had been too busy fighting on every other front to think about the original architecture of the claim. Marsh had not thought about it either, or he had thought about it and decided the federal copy was too remote to matter, that by the time anyone went looking for it, the county record would be established, fact, and the property would already be in his hands. He had been wrong. "Hargreaves is filing the injunction today," Elias said, with specific language addressing the claimed irregularity and referencing the federal record as the controlling document. He crouched down in front of her so he was at her level, which was something he did not do casually, and she understood it as a deliberate choice. "It's not over. He'll still fight it." But the ground just shifted, Clara. He was standing on something he thought was solid, and it turned out to be yours. She looked at him. "James filed right," she said, and her voice caught on the last word in a way she hadn't prepared for. "He did," Elias said. "He did everything right," she said. "He filed the claim right, and he paid the fees right, and he worked this land right, and then he went out in August to protect what he'd built right, and—" She stopped. She looked at the gate, at the road south where James had died. She breathed. "He did everything he was supposed to do." "Yes," Elias said. "He did." She was quiet for a moment. "The deed is going to hold," she said. "The deed is going to hold," he confirmed. She looked at him crouching in front of her with the afternoon light going flat and cold around them, and the 3 men still camped at the Henderson place 2 miles south, and the injunction being filed in Helena, and everything that had happened in the 10 days since a stranger came through her gate to free a horse. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "When you rode to Millhaven just now," she said, "I spent 2 hours on this porch watching the road, and the thing I thought about most was whether you were coming back." She held his gaze with the directness she gave to everything that mattered. "Not whether you were coming back today, whether you were coming back at all, whether tomorrow or the next day you'd decide the mountain was easier and the work here was done and—" "Clara," he said. "Let me say it," she said. He closed his mouth. "I don't need saving," she said. "I've been doing this alone for 8 months, and I was doing it before that, and I know how to do it. I'm not asking you to stay because I can't manage without you." She paused. "I'm asking you to stay because I don't want to do it without you. There's a difference, and it matters to me that you understand the difference." Elias looked at her for a long moment, I know the difference, he said. I've known it for a while. Then say what you're going to say, she said. He looked at her, and something in his face came undone, in the careful, deliberate way of a man who had kept things locked down for so long that opening them required intention rather than accident. I've been on that mountain for 10 years, he said, because the mountain asked nothing of me and gave me enough to survive, and I had decided that surviving was sufficient. He paused. I came down to resupply. I stopped at your gate because your horse was down. I cut your wood and ate your stew and slept in your spare room and told myself every step of the way that I was just being decent. He looked at her. I stopped telling myself that somewhere around the second morning. The second morning, she said. When you brought the coffee out without asking if I wanted any, he said. Because you already knew I did. He held her gaze. That was the moment I understood I was in trouble. Clara looked at him. She looked at this man who had appeared at her gate like an answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking, who had seen her clearly from the first day and never tried to make her into something more manageable, who had ridden into Canyon Country with her and sat outside a lawyer's office and told her about Alice. Stay, she said. It was not a plea. It was not a question. It was the same voice she had used in the canyon, the voice that had no room in it for doubt. Yes, he said. And that single word carried the weight of 10 years of mountain solitude, and Alice and Tennessee, and every careful brick of isolation he had built. And all of it was in the word, and all of it was being set down. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they stayed like that on the porch step in the cold afternoon for a long time, without either of them needing to say anything else. The federal injunction arrived the following morning by special rider from Millhaven. Hargreaves had paid the premium to get it there fast, which told Clara something about how seriously he was taking the timeline. She signed for it and read every word of it standing in the yard, and then she walked to the gate and nailed a copy to the post where Marsh's men could see it from the road. By that afternoon, the camp at the Henderson place was empty. She did not celebrate. She did not allow herself the luxury of thinking it was over, because Hargreaves had said 6 months, possibly a year, and she trusted Hargreaves to know what he was talking about. But she allowed herself to stand at the south fence and look at the Henderson place with its empty hitching post and think, you came, and you watched, and you left. That was something. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were the right kind of hard, the kind that came from work rather than fear. Hargreaves moved the federal case forward with the focused efficiency of a man who had been waiting for this case, and he wrote to Clara every 2 weeks with updates that were precise and legible, and that she read at the kitchen table with Elias across from her, and then filed in the strongbox that now held the developing architecture of Harlan Marsh's legal reckoning. Marsh hired a lawyer from Denver who was expensive and well-connected, and who filed 3 separate motions in the first month that were each addressed and countered by Hargreaves, with a thoroughness that Clara found deeply satisfying to read about. Margaret Hale's 4 years of documentation turned out to be even more significant than Hargreaves had initially indicated. It established a pattern so clear that the federal prosecutor who joined the case in the 3rd month described it, in a letter that Hargreaves forwarded to Clara, as the most comprehensively documented land fraud scheme he had encountered in 15 years of territorial prosecution. Doyle testified formally in the 4th month, as part of a deal for reduced sentencing that Clara had complicated feelings about, and accepted as the necessary pragmatism of a legal system that needed his testimony more than it needed his punishment. He said everything he had said in the canyon, and more. Names, dates, the specific instruction from Marsh regarding the August operation, the fact that he had been told the husband might resist and to handle it, words that landed in Clara's chest like stones, and that she read twice and put down and did not pick back up that day. She told Elias that night. She said it the way she said everything now, directly, sitting across from him at the table that had become the center of their lives together. She said what Doyle had testified, and what it meant in terms of the legal case, and what it meant in terms of James. And Elias listened to all of it with the complete attention she had come to rely on. And when she was done, he said, "Does that change anything for you?" "It confirms what I already knew," she said. It wasn't August getting out of hand. It was August, going exactly as Marsh intended. "Yes," he said. "Which means—" She stopped. She worked through it. "Which means that everything after August was deliberate too. Every visit, every offer. Every time he came to this door with that smile and those papers, knowing what his men had done. Knowing I knew James had been killed, but not knowing that I'd figured out he was behind it." She looked at her hands. "He sat at this gate and offered me money for James's land while James's blood was still on the ground." Elias was very still. "I want him to answer for that specifically," she said. "Not just the land fraud. For James specifically." "Hargreaves is building toward it," Elias said. "The murder instruction is in the federal record now. That goes beyond civil fraud." "How far beyond?" "Far enough," he said, and his voice was quiet and certain. "He will answer for James." She looked at him and believed him, not because she needed to be reassured, but because she had spent enough time with him now to know when he was certain and when he was managing her, and this was certainty. "All right," she said. In the 5th month, Harlan Marsh was formally indicted on 7 counts of federal land fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy, and 1 count of accessory to homicide. Clara read the indictment at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her, and read each count individually and let herself feel each one. The accessory count was the last. She read it 3 times. She had not cried in front of anyone since James died. She had made that decision in the first week, in the understanding that crying in front of people in this county would be used as evidence of exactly what they expected her to be. Too soft, too weak, too much a woman to hold this land. She had kept to that decision through everything. She kept to it now. But she sat at the table for a long time after she put the indictment down, and Elias, who had been reading his own copy at the other end of the table, looked at her and said nothing, and did not move toward her, and did not try to do anything about what was on her face. He just said quietly, "He's going to answer for it." "Yes," she said. "He is." She stood up. She went to the shelf and took down the photograph of James in his good coat. She held it for a moment, really held it. Not the way she had been holding it for months, which was the way you hold something fragile that might break if you squeeze, but the way you hold something that belongs to you. "We've got him, James," she said quietly. She put the photograph back on the shelf. She picked up her coffee. She went back to work. Marsh was convicted in the 9th month of the year following James's death. The trial was in Helena, and Clara rode there with Elias and Margaret Hale, and she sat in the courtroom for 4 days and listened to Hargreaves lay out the architecture of 15 years of careful theft with the methodical, devastating clarity of a man who had been building toward this for a long time. She listened to Doyle testify. She listened to Marsh's Denver lawyer try to reframe and minimize and redirect. And she watched Hargreaves counter each attempt with the specific document that made the attempt irrelevant. On the 4th day, she listened to the jury come back. Guilty on all 7 counts of federal land fraud. Guilty on both conspiracy counts. Guilty on the accessory to homicide count, which the judge received with an expression that suggested this particular verdict carried weight even in a room that had heard a great deal. Clara sat in the gallery and heard each word and felt each one land in the place where she had been carrying them. Marsh stood at the defendant's table and said nothing, which was the right choice. And his lawyer said something about appeal, which was his right. And the judge said something about sentencing in 30 days. And none of it was as loud in Clara's head as the word guilty repeated 9 times in a row, like 9 stones finally placed in the right order. She did not make a sound. She was aware of Elias beside her, the warmth and weight of him, his hand briefly over hers in the gallery, there and then gone, which was the right amount. In the corridor afterward, Hargreaves found her and shook her hand and said, "It held." Just those 2 words, because they were sufficient. "It held," she agreed. Margaret Hale embraced her, which was unexpected and warm, and Clara let it be both, because she had been getting better at letting things be what they were. On the road home, they rode mostly in silence for the first hours, which was how both of them processed things. Not talking until the feelings had been sorted enough to be talked about without taking over the words. The Montana Territory moved around them, wide and cold in the way of early winter, The kind of cold that was honest about itself. "What do you want to do with the property?" Elias asked, about 2 hours out. "Now that it's clear." She looked at him. "I want to run it," she said. "The way James intended, the way I've been running it." "The way we've been running it," he said. She looked at the road ahead. "The way we've been running it," she agreed. I was quiet for a moment. "There's a section north of the home pasture that James never broke," he said. "I was looking at it last week. The soil's good, better than the south field." "James always said he'd get to it," Clara said. "Spring after spring." "Spring's 4 months out," Elias said. She looked at him. She looked at this man who had come down from a mountain for supplies and stayed because a woman asked him to dinner, and had become, in the months between that night and this road, so completely present in her life that she could not clearly remember what the days had felt like without him. "4 months is enough time to plan it properly," she said. "It is," he said, "and build the fence around it, and break the first section of ground if the thaw comes early," he said. "It usually does," she said. They rode on. The ranch came into view in the late afternoon, and it looked exactly as they had left it. The cabin, the barn, the fences along the north and east and south, the cattle in the pasture, the woodpile that was high and solid because they had spent 3 days building it before the Helena ride. It looked like what it was, a working piece of Montana land that had survived a hard year and was intact. Clara stopped her horse at the gate. She looked at the property. She looked at the gate post where she had nailed the injunction months ago, the nail holes still visible in the wood. She looked at the fence line along the north that she and Elias had rebuilt rail by rail. She looked at the cabin where a single lamp burned in the window, because Elias had had the habit of leaving a light when they were both going to be gone for a day. A small and ordinary and domestic habit that had been noted and that she had never commented on because she had not wanted to make it into something fragile by naming it. She looked at all of it. She thought about James. She thought about August, and what Doyle had said about August, and what the jury had said about August today in that courtroom in Helena. She thought about the weight of the last year and where it lived in her body now. Not gone, not something that would ever be entirely gone, but settled. Moved into the part of a person where hard things lived when they had been properly grieved and answered for and made to mean something. She thought about the fact that she was 30 years old, and that the land ahead of her was hers, and that the man beside her had said "we" in the easy, habitual way of someone who had made a decision so thoroughly that the word arrived without ceremony. "I want to ask you something," she said. Elias looked at her. "I'm going to run this ranch for the rest of my life," she said. "That's not in question. It's not negotiable, and it's not subject to anyone else's permission or preference." She held his gaze. "But I would rather run it with you than without you. And I am not asking you to stay because I need you to. I am asking you to stay because you belong here, and I think you know that, and I think you've known it for a while, and I'd like you to say it out loud so we're both clear." Elias looked at her for a long time. The wind moved across the valley. The cattle shifted in the south pasture. The lamp burned in the cabin window. "I belong here," he said. He said it the way she said things, plainly, without ornamentation, as a statement of fact that had been true long enough to speak without ceremony. "I've belonged here since the second morning. I just needed you to ask me to say it." Clara looked at him one moment longer. Then she opened the gate and rode through, and he rode through after her, and she latched the gate behind them, and they put the horses in the barn and came back out into the cold evening, and she went up the porch steps, and he came up behind her, and she opened the cabin door. The warmth of the stove hit her face. She went inside. The photograph of James was on the shelf where it had always been, where it would always be, because this was his land too, and his name was in the federal record that no one could alter, and he was part of every rail of every fence and every inch of every field, and she was never going to pretend otherwise. She put her coat on the hook. She put water on to boil. She heard Elias come in behind her and close the door against the cold, and she heard him hang his coat beside hers, and she heard the particular quiet of a house that had 2 people in it instead of 1, that different quality of silence, occupied and warm. She looked out the window at the Montana evening closing in over the hills. She had come to this land as a wife, and stayed on it as a widow, and fought for it as a woman who refused to be defined by either word alone. She had sent evidence to federal courts, and ridden into canyons, and sat in lawyers' offices, and listened to 9 guilty verdicts read aloud in a Helena courtroom, and she had done all of it without being saved, without being rescued, without being anything other than exactly what she was. A woman who had asked a stranger to stay for dinner, and in doing so had changed both their lives into something neither of them had known how to want until they found it. The water began to heat. Elias sat down at the table. Clara turned from the window and looked at him. This man who had come down from the mountain looking for nothing and found everything, who had held a horse's leg in the snow and cut wood in a storm and spoken Alice's name out loud for only the 4th time in 10 years, who had said, "We like it" was the most natural word in the English language and meant every syllable of it. She looked at him and thought, this is what it looks like when 2 broken people stop using their brokenness as a reason not to try. "Coffee?" she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She made the coffee. She brought it to the table and sat across from him, and they held their cups in both hands, the way they both did in cold weather. And outside the Montana night came down over the hills with all its dark and cold and enormous indifference, and inside the lamp burned, and the stove crackled, and the ranch that had survived everything it had been asked to survive stood solid on its own ground. Clara Whitmore had pressed a rifle to a stranger's chest at her gate and told him she would put him in the ground. She had asked him to stay for dinner instead. And that was the night the wandering stopped, for both of them, and the living began.